Celestine Harrow didn't whisper it. She said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. She stood in the center of the Coldwater County Hall, dressed in silk the color of winter cream, pearls at her throat, every inch of her arranged for maximum effect, and she looked Rosa Blackwood over the way a buyer inspects livestock at auction. Slow, deliberate, with her mouth already curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Thorne always did have unusual tastes, Celestine said, lifting her voice just enough to carry to the nearest cluster of county wives. Though I suppose when a man needs someone around the food all day, she let the rest hang there, unfinished, because the unfinished version was crueler than anything she could have completed. The room went quiet, not the polite quiet of people pretending not to hear. The sharp, held-breath quiet of people who had heard every word and were waiting to see what the big woman in the practical dress would do about it. Rosa's face went hot from her throat to her hairline. She had been hearing versions of that sentence since she was 9 years old. She knew exactly what it meant. She knew exactly where it landed. She just hadn't expected it here, not in front of Thorne, not in front of half the county. If you want to find out what Rosa did next and what Celestine Harrow eventually lost because of that moment, then stay right here with us. We have a story that runs 5 full parts, and not a single one of them ends the way you'll expect. Before we go any further, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do it right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss a single episode. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled now. Let's go back to the beginning. The advertisement had been written in plain language, which was the only thing about Thorne Blackwood that Rosa trusted before she ever met him. Cattle Ranch, Coldwater County, Montana, seeking capable woman for household management and cook position. 24 men, practical arrangement, no illusions offered. No illusions offered. Rosa had read those 3 words 4 times sitting at her kitchen table in Ohio, with $41 in a coffee tin and a landlord's notice folded under her bread bowl. She had read advertisements that promised partnership, companionship, shared futures, new beginnings. She had learned what those words usually meant when they came from men she had never met. Thorne Blackwood's advertisement didn't promise anything except work and a practical arrangement, and somehow that was the most honest thing she'd read in 2 years of looking. She wrote back the same afternoon. His reply came in 11 days. 2 paragraphs. Her duties. Her travel reimbursement. His one condition. I need someone who will actually stay. Rosa packed her trunk that evening. She was 32 years old, wide-hipped, broad-shouldered, with strong arms that had been feeding other people's families for most of her adult life, and a face that strangers found easy to dismiss the moment they'd cataloged her body. She knew what she looked like. She knew what people decided about her before she opened her mouth. She had stopped fighting the deciding a long time ago and started focusing instead on what came after the moment they tasted her bread or watched her get a kitchen running in an unfamiliar space in under 2 hours, or came back to her table 4 nights in a row because whatever she was doing with root vegetables and a ham bone was something they couldn't explain and couldn't stop eating. That was the only kind of argument Rosa knew how to make. She made it with her hands. The stagecoach from Billings took most of a day and deposited her at the edge of Blackwood Ranch in the middle of the afternoon with a trunk, a canvas bag of kitchen tools she refused to travel without, and mud on her boots from the last quarter-mile of unpaved road. There were 6 men standing near the barn when she arrived. Not waiting for her specifically, they had work, but pausing in that particular way. Men pause when something worth looking at has appeared. Rosa recognized the pause. She'd spent her life inside it. She looked at them steadily and said nothing. Thorne Blackwood came out of the main house and crossed the yard with the kind of walk that said he owned the ground under his boots. He was somewhere past 40, with a broad chest and a face that had been weathered by years outdoors into something angular and hard. Not unpleasant, just closed. The face of a man who had learned to run his expressions the same way he ran his ranch. Efficiently, without waste. He stopped in front of her and looked at her. Not the way the men by the barn had looked. He wasn't measuring her body. He was watching her eyes. Rosa met his gaze and kept it there. She didn't smile apologetically. She didn't look at the ground. She didn't offer any of the small social surrenders she'd learned men expected from women in her position. Women arriving uncertain, women dependent, women who needed to demonstrate right away that they understood their place. Thorne's expression shifted in some way she couldn't quite name. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said. It was her married name, kept out of habit and practicality. The marriage itself was 2 years buried along with a man who had eaten her cooking and spent her wages and left her nothing but debt and a last name she was still deciding whether to keep. "Mr. Blackwood," she answered. He picked up her trunk before she could argue about it. She noted that. Not because it was gentlemanly, it might have been purely practical, but because he did it without waiting for her to look helpless first. "Kitchen's through here," he said. She followed him inside. The kitchen was a disaster, not the kind of disaster that happens in a day or a week. This was the accumulated evidence of years of neglect, the slow kind, where nobody made one catastrophic decision, but instead thousands of small ones, each manageable on its own, each adding to a cumulative decay that was now so total it had started to feel normal. The stove plates were black with grease that had been burned and reburned so many times it had fused to the iron. The flour sacks nearest the wall had gone soft with moisture, and when Rosa pressed 2 fingers against one, they came away smelling of mold. 3 shelves had cracked and been propped up with whatever was available in one case, what appeared to be a fence post. The pantry wall had a slow leak she could see by the dark stain that ran floor to ceiling along the corner. Mouse droppings in the grain, cracked cookware stacked without any logic she could identify. Dish towels that should have been burned instead of folded. She stood in the middle of it and turned a slow circle. Behind her, Thorne folded his arms. She could feel him watching her face for her reaction. "Men have eaten out of here for years," he said. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite defensive and wasn't quite proud, somewhere between the two. The voice of a man preparing to argue before he knows what he's arguing against. Rosa finished her circuit. "Then you've been lucky nobody died," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Thorne's jaw tightened. "You're here to cook?" "No," Rosa said. Turned to face him fully. "I'm here to run your household." Difference. A cook works in whatever space she's given. A housekeeper makes the space worth working in. She looked at the stove. "I can't feed 24 men out of this kitchen. Not safely. Not well. So before I make supper, we need to talk about what this is going to take to fix." "We need to talk about it," Thorne repeated. "Yes. You've been here 4 minutes. 4 minutes was enough," Rosa said. "How long did it take you to know it was bad?" Something moved across his face. Not anger exactly. More like recognition, the involuntary acknowledgement of a truth he'd been successfully ignoring. His arms tightened across his chest. "What do you need?" he said finally. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't even cooperation. It was a man closing one argument before a worse one developed. But it was enough, Rosa told him. She needed new flour and salt and sugar from town. She needed oil she could actually cook with, instead of whatever that was in the jar near the stove. She needed lye soap and clean rags and the name of whoever was responsible for the leak in the pantry wall. She needed the cracked shelving replaced or properly braced. She needed the stove cleaned before she put heat through it, or it would smoke the whole house. Thorne listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "That's going to take days." 3 days, Rosa agreed. "Maybe 4. My men need to eat tonight." "I know. I'll manage tonight with what's salvageable. But tomorrow we start on the repairs, and I won't cook the day after until the stove is clean enough to use properly." Thorne stared at her. She stared back. "Fine," he said. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, and Rosa couldn't tell if he was furious or something else entirely, so she let him go and turned back to the wreckage in front of her and started deciding what could be saved. The ranch hands came in for supper that first evening in the practiced way of men who had given up, expecting much the shuffled entrance, the grabbing of seats, the immediate reaching for whatever was on the table before it could disappear. What was on the table stopped them. Rosa had worked with spoiled supplies, short time, and a stove she didn't trust, and she had produced a pot of bean soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, salt pork fried until it had some dignity back, a pan of cornbread that was slightly dense from the questionable flour but hot and real, and a pot of coffee so strong, two of the younger hands would later admit they'd had trouble sleeping. It wasn't magnificent. It was honest. The room got quiet in a different way from how it had been quiet before. Not uncomfortable quiet, the quiet of men concentrating. A young hand near the far end of the table, Rosa had not yet learned. His name leaned toward the man beside him and said something low. The other man snorted. Rosa was carrying the soup pot back toward the stove. She heard it. She did not turn around. She was almost certain she'd heard the word sighs. She set the pot down and stood with her back to the table for exactly 2 breaths. Then she picked up the coffee pot and went back to filling cups. Because supper was not finished, and she had 23 more men to serve, and the judgment of a 20-year-old who didn't know anything about her was not going to make that number any smaller. Old Wade Tully was watching her from his seat at the near end of the table. He was somewhere in his 60s, lean and weathered as old rope, with a foreman's habit of watching everything without appearing to. He barely touched his soup. He touched it now. He didn't say anything until he'd finished the bowl. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked down the table with an expression Rosa would come to recognize over the following months, a look that wasn't loud, but that nobody on the ranch ever argued with. "Anybody laughs at that woman again," Wade said. "Better do it somewhere I can't hear." The table went very still. Then the young hand Emmett Shaw, as she would later learn, 19 years old and still more instinct than sense, nodded at his bowl and said, "Yes, sir." Across the room, Thorne Blackwood was eating in the doorway of the kitchen, rather than at the table. He did that the first night without explaining it, and he would do it again the second night and the third. Rosa would later understand it was how he had been eating for 4 years, present enough to supervise, far enough removed to stay closed. But that first evening she didn't know any of that. She just knew that he was there, and that when Wade spoke, Thorne's eyes moved from the table to her and stayed there for a moment before he looked down at his plate. She couldn't read his expression. She decided not to try. She started on the kitchen the next morning before anyone else was awake. Hauling water. Scrubbing. The grease on the stove plates required 3 applications of lye solution and a cast iron scraper she'd borrowed from the blacksmith's shop, and by the end of the first hour her arms ached from the shoulder down. She worked until the first shift of ranch hands appeared for breakfast, produced eggs and salt pork and leftover cornbread and more coffee, then went straight back to the scrubbing. 2 of the men offered to help during the mid-morning break. She thanked them and pointed them at the shelving. By mid-afternoon, Emmett Shaw appeared in the kitchen doorway with a length of new board over his shoulder. Wade said the shelves needed wood, he told her. He was 19 and trying not to look at her directly, which she appreciated. "They do," Rosa said. "Can you cut to measurement?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. I'll give you the dimensions." He worked alongside her for 2 hours without talking much, which she also appreciated. When he left, he nodded at the half-clean stove. "You're really going to have that thing cooking again by tomorrow?" "Plan on it," Rosa said. He nodded again, like this was information he intended to believe. The second day, she worked through the pantry, everything out, the leak source identified and patched with the materials Thorne had sent for from town, the shelving scrubbed and dried before the new provisions went in. She organized by category, by frequency of use, by weight. She inventoried as she went, writing figures in a small notebook with a pencil she kept in her apron pocket, and by the time she finished, she had a clear picture of what the ranch had, what it would need by January, and where the current supply plan was going to create serious problems long before spring. Thorne appeared in the pantry doorway on the afternoon of the second day. He looked at the organized shelves. He looked at her notebook. He said nothing. "Your flour supply will run short by February," Rosa told him, not looking up. "Based on 24 men and current consumption rates. You're also low on salt pork, and you'll need more dried beans than you have. If you want, I can write up the full calculation." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn to calculate that?" "Running households," Rosa said. "You count what you have. You count how many mouths. You count the weeks. The arithmetic isn't complicated. The last arrangement didn't involve arithmetic." "What did the last arrangement involve?" "Buying more when we ran out." Rosa looked up from her notebook. "In February. In Montana." Thorne's expression didn't change. It was expensive, he admitted. I imagined so, she said, and went back to her writing. She heard him exhale once, not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. Then he left. On the third day, she cooked. Really cooked. She was up 2 hours before first light, with the stove clean and drawing properly, and the pantry organized around her like something she had built rather than inherited. She made slow roasted beef that had been sitting in salt and dried herbs since the previous afternoon. Bread that rose properly because the flour was fresh and she had time to let it, root vegetables and beef fat with dried onion, thick gravy from the roasting pan, and the coffee, always strong. By the time the men filed in, the smell had done half the work already. The silence that followed the first bites was a different animal from the silence of that first evening. That had been the quiet of men not expecting much. This was the quiet of men who had been given something they hadn't known they were missing. Wade ate the entire meal without speaking. When he put his fork down, he looked at his empty plate for a second and then looked down the table. I'd like to know, he said to the room in general, the last time any of you ate like that. Nobody had an answer. At the far end of the table, the young hand, who had said something about Rosa's size 2 days ago, was looking at his plate with the particular expression of someone doing arithmetic they don't like the result of. Rosa was refilling cups. She didn't say anything. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. That evening Thorne was in the kitchen doorway again when she was cleaning up. She was washing the bread pans with her back to him, and she heard him come in and stop. That was good, he said, as if the words were being extracted. Rosa didn't turn around. Thank you. The men were quiet. They were hungry, Rosa said. Not just for food. She heard him shift his weight. What does that mean? It means men eat differently when the food is made with attention. She kept washing. They can tell the difference. They don't always have language for it, but they can tell. Thorne was quiet. Then he said the supply calculations. Can you write them up? Already started, Rosa said. Another pause. All right, he said. And then he went, and Rosa stood in her rebuilt kitchen, still not beautiful, still rough, but clean and functional, and hers in whatever way a place can belong to you when you've put that many hours of hard labor into it, and she let herself feel, just for a moment, that she had done something real. Weeks passed. October moved toward November with the particular brutality of Montana, and Rosa settled into the ranch's rhythms with the same systematic attention she'd given the pantry. She learned who ate quickly and who lingered. She learned Wade's preference for bitter coffee and Emmett's weakness for anything sweet, and the fact that the two hands who worked the north fence line came in 20 minutes later than everyone else and needed their food held warm. She also began to notice things she wasn't being paid to notice. Emmett Shaw had been coughing for a week before she caught him at the water pump one morning, looking gray around the edges, trying to fill his canteen with hands that were shaking slightly. She put the back of her hand against his forehead before he could object and felt what she'd suspected. You're feverish, she told him. I'm fine, he said. He was 19. Being fine was a philosophical position, not a medical one. You're not fine. You've been not fine for a week. Rosa looked at him steadily. If you work in that state and it gets worse, you'll be out for a month instead of a week, which is worse for you and worse for the ranch. He shifted the canteen to his other hand. Mr. Blackwood needs. Go inside, Rosa said. I'll speak to Mr. Blackwood. She found Thorne in the yard talking with Wade about fencing, and she walked directly into the conversation without apologizing for the interruption, which made Thorne's expression tighten briefly. Emmett Shaw's running a fever, she said. He needs to be inside today. He probably needs a doctor. Thorne looked past her toward the barn. He said he was fine this morning. He lied this morning. He's not going to admit it because he's 19 years old and he thinks sick means weak, Rosa said. He's wrong. The fever's real. I need you to tell him to go inside because he'll listen to you and he won't listen to me. Wade was watching this exchange with the unreadable expression of a man who has spent 40 years watching other people argue and has learned to find it educational. Thorne looked at Rosa for a moment. Then he handed Wade the fence diagram and walked toward the barn. Emmett was in bed by noon, and the doctor came out from Coldwater the following morning and confirmed a lung inflammation that Left untreated another week in cold air, would have become serious. Emmett recovered in 10 days, back at full strength by the end of the month. He never laughed at Rosa after that. None of them did, really. Not because they were afraid of her, because they had started to trust her in the incremental, unglamorous way that men trust people who turn out to be consistently right. It was Wade who first said anything, in his oblique way. He came to the kitchen one evening, while Rosa was preparing the next morning's bread, sitting at the far end of the work table with his coffee, and said without preamble, "You notice, Mr. Blackwood's been eating in here more." Rosa kept kneading. "Eats where he wants. He didn't used to want to eat in here," Wade said. "He didn't used to want to eat with people much at all. He drank his coffee. 4 years, since the first Mrs. Blackwood passed." Rosa kept her hands moving. "That's not my business." "Didn't say it was," Wade agreed. He put his cup down. "Just making an observation. She'd noticed, of course. She'd have been willfully blind not to." Thorne had started appearing in the kitchen without any evident purpose for coffee when there was coffee available in the dining room, to fix a hinge on the pantry door 2 days after it started sticking, to stand in the doorway in the evenings asking questions about provisions that could just as easily have waited until morning. He never stayed long. He never said anything personal. But he came. Rosa had decided not to construct a story around it, because she had built stories around men's behavior before and found that the stories she told herself bore very little relationship to what the men were actually doing. So she kneaded her bread and noted his presence and did not reach for an explanation. Celestine Harrow arrived at the Kellerman family's winter gathering in early December with the confidence of a woman accustomed to being the most important person in any room she entered. Rosa had heard the name before arriving. Coldwater County was not large, and its gossip moved quickly. She knew Celestine was from old ranch money, that she was handsome and carefully maintained, that she had known Thorne most of her adult life, and that the news of his mail-order marriage had not been received warmly. What she hadn't understood until she was standing in the Kellerman parlor, surrounded by county families, and watching Celestine cross the room toward them, was how deliberate the woman was. Celestine approached with perfect social grace, greeting 3 people by name on her way over, complimenting Helen Kellerman on her dress, laughing at something the county sheriff said. By the time she reached Rosa and Thorne, she had established herself as the room's center of gravity. She looked Rosa over, not quickly, not accidentally. Slowly, the way you look at something you've already decided about and are now simply confirming. "Thorne," she said warmly, touching his arm. Then she redirected her attention, that was the word for it. Redirected, the way you turn a lamp, to Rosa. "You must be the new wife. We've all been so curious." Rosa knew what was coming. She had been in enough rooms with enough women like Celestine to feel it building. "Rosamond Blackwood," she said, "though most people call me Rosa." Celestine smiled. It was a lovely smile. That was the particular cruelty of it. "Of course. I've heard so much." She tilted her head slightly. The gesture of a woman performing interest. "You've been doing wonders with Thorne's kitchen, they say. He always did need someone capable around the house." "The ranch needed organizing," Rosa agreed. She kept her voice even. "Well," Celestine lifted her glass, "I suppose that's what you're here for." And then she said it, loud enough, deliberate enough. "Thorne always did have unusual tastes. Though I suppose when a man needs someone around the food all day." She let it die there. Rosa's face went hot. Her hands at her sides were perfectly still. Around them, the near part of the room had gone quiet. Thorne stepped forward. Rosa moved her hand to his arm, not grabbing. Just a brief pressure, the kind that means stop without saying it, and he felt it and went still. She looked at Celestine. "The county fair," Rosa said. Her voice was steady. She didn't know where the words came from, she hadn't planned them. But they were there, solid and clear. "I've heard you've won the preserves competition twice." Celestine blinked, slightly thrown by the pivot. "I have." "Then I suppose," Rosa said, "I'll know exactly who I have to beat." The silence stretched for 2 full seconds. Then Wade, from somewhere behind her, made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh. Celestine's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did a slight recalibration, the adjustment of a woman who had expected a different kind of response. How charming, Celestine said and moved on. Rosa stayed where she was. Her face was still hot. Her hands were still perfectly still. Thorne leaned toward her close enough that she could hear him without anyone else catching it. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Rosa said quietly. I could have. I know you could have. She looked straight ahead. That's exactly why I had to be the one to do it. He was quiet for a moment. Can you beat her? He asked. Rosa considered this honestly. I don't know, she said. But I'm going to try. She started preparing for the fair the same week. Not obsessively, she had a ranch to run and 24 men to feed and a winter supply schedule to maintain. But methodically, with the same attention she brought to everything. She pulled out her mother's recipe for molasses bread, tested it twice, adjusted the salt content for the altitude. She went through the provisions for preserves and settled on the sour cherries from the abandoned orchard at the ranch's eastern edge, small, tart, slightly imperfect. The kind of fruit that required skill to balance rather than quality to sell itself. Thorne came out to the orchard with her one afternoon when she was checking the last of the harvest stock. Those are from Lydia's orchard, he said. He was looking at the tree with an expression she recognized by now, not grief exactly, but the particular tension of a man pressing down on a wound to keep it closed. I know, Rosa said. Wade told me. She looked at the jars of sour cherries she'd carried out to check. The tree still produces good fruit. She planted it the first year we were married. Rosa was quiet. I haven't gone in there since she died, Thorne said. His voice was flat. Not cold flat, the way a voice goes when the flatness is doing structural work. I noticed the gate was locked, Rosa said. It stayed locked. Push. She picked up her jar and checked the seal and wrote a note in her pocketbook. After a moment, Thorne turned away from the orchard and went back toward the barn. And Rosa stayed where she was and looked at the cherry tree through the iron fence and thought about grief and locked gates and the particular cruelty of a person who preserves loss by refusing to let anything around it keep living. She thought about it for a while. Then she went inside and made bread. The winter fair was 6 weeks away when Emmett found her in the kitchen one evening, looking worried in a way he seemed to have decided required immediate reporting to someone. There's talk in town, he said. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. About the fair. What kind of talk? Rosa asked. Celestine kind. He shifted his weight. She's been saying you only entered to make a fool of yourself. That you don't know what a county fair actually expects. That you're going to... He stopped. Going to what? Emmett looked at his hat. Embarrass Mr. Blackwood. Rosa considered this. Emmett, she said, what did you think of the sour cherry preserves I sent out with the lunch pails last week? He looked up. Best thing I've eaten since... He stopped again for different reasons. A real long time. Good, Rosa said. Then let's not worry about what Celestine is saying in town. He nodded. He seemed reassured by this, which reassured Rosa in turn, not because Emmett's reassurance settled anything, but because a 19-year-old boy who had once laughed at her size was now worried on her behalf. And that meant something, though she couldn't have said precisely what. After he left, she went to her notebook and added a line to the fair preparation list. Then she boiled another batch of cherries and got back to work. 3 weeks before the fair, at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning, Rosa was in the kitchen starting the bread when she heard the sound. A crack, then a grinding, then a long structural moan from above her head. She had exactly enough time to step back from the work table before the corner of the kitchen roof came down. Not all of it. One section, maybe 8 feet by 4, collapsed under what she would later learn had been a combination of ice accumulation and something else. The edge of the work table where she'd been standing was buried under wet timber and roofing material. Cold air poured through the gap. Rain that had been threatening since the previous evening began coming through immediately. She stood in the wrecked kitchen and looked at the flour sacks, soaking through, the shelving knocked sideways by the impact, 3 months of careful organization suddenly sitting under standing water and debris. She stood there for 30 seconds. Then she went to find Wade. Thorne came running when he heard, which was faster than she'd expected. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the damage and then looking at Rosa, and his face was doing something complicated that she didn't try to parse. Forget the fair, he told her. His voice was gruff in the way voices get when they're covering for something softer underneath. I'll rebuild everything. Better than before. I know you will, Rosa said. So forget the fair. No, Thorne stared at her. Rosa's, we rebuild, she said. Together. And then I go to the fair. She looked at the hole in the ceiling. Where's the smokehouse on the property? Thorne blinked. The old one? East side of the barn. We don't use it. We do now, Rosa said. I need to move the cooking operation while the kitchen's repaired. I need the undamaged provisions relocated today before anything else gets wet. I need someone on that roof by this afternoon, and I need to know if there's enough dry lumber on the property or if we need to send to town. Thorne looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, calling Wade's name. Rosa started pulling salvageable provisions from the shelves. What happened next was something she had not planned and would not have thought to ask for. The men came. Not because Thorne ordered it. He ordered some of them, but not all of them. The ones who came on their own came because they wanted to. Wade was on the roof, within the hour, climbing with the agility of a man 20 years younger. Emmett hauled lumber through the rain for 3 straight hours without being asked twice. 2 of the hands she barely knew the names of appeared in the smokehouse to help her set up a functional cooking operation in a space not designed for it, moving the iron stove piece by piece and reinstalling the ventilation by feel and experience. By mid-afternoon, Rosa was cooking again, not elegantly, not comfortably, in a smokehouse with a relocated stove and improvised shelving and rain hammering the roof and her boots soaked through from the morning's work. But cooking. That evening, feeding 24 men out of a converted smokehouse, while Thorne and Wade worked on the kitchen roof by lamplight, Rosa looked around at what had been built in a single day and felt something shift in her chest, not pride exactly, something more complicated. The knowledge that she had not done this alone. That the men who had once judged her body had stood in the rain and hauled lumber for her, because somewhere in the past week she had become, without planning it or naming it, the kind of person worth standing in the rain for. It was Thorne who found her late that night, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and she was cleaning up in the smokehouse by lamplight. He stood in the doorway and didn't say anything at first. Wade found something, he said finally. Rosa looked up from the wash basin. The roof didn't fail from ice, Thorne said. His voice was very controlled. The fasteners on that section had been loosened. 3 of them. Purpose. The wash basin water went cold around Rosa's hands. She looked at Thorne. His jaw was set in a way she'd never seen before, not the closed, controlled expression of a man managing his feelings, but the hard, flat expression of a man who had moved past managing. Who? Rosa asked. Thorne didn't answer immediately. When he did, he only said, We're going to find out. Rosa looked at the lamplight on the smokehouse walls. She thought about Celestine Harrow's smile and the weight of that moment in the Kellerman parlor and the talk Emmett had reported from town. She thought about what it meant that someone had wanted her kitchen destroyed before the fair badly enough to come on to Blackwood Ranch in the night and loosen roof fasteners and wait for weather to do the rest. She turned back to the wash basin. Then we find out, she said. After the fair. Thorne watched her for a moment. Still going, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm still going, Rosa said. She heard him exhale not quite a sigh, not quite something else. Then he said, I'll have the kitchen rebuilt by the time you get back. I know, she said. She didn't look up from the water. But she was listening to his footsteps as he left, and when they faded, she stood still for a moment in the smokehouse, with her cold hands in the basin, and let herself feel, for the first time since the roof came down, how frightened she had been. Just for a moment. Then she drained the basin, dried her hands, and went to bed. She had a fair to win. The smokehouse smelled like old hickory and iron and the ghost of 100 past winters, and Rosa had been awake in it since 4 in the morning. She hadn't planned to wake that early. She'd gone to bed telling herself she would sleep until 5:30, which was already an hour less than she needed, and her body had decided that 4 was more appropriate given everything that was pressing against the inside of her skull. The loosened roof fasteners, the ruined flower, the fair 3 weeks away. Celestine Harrow's smile. Thorne's jaw set in that hard, flat way she'd never seen before. She lay on her back for approximately 90 seconds, accepted that sleep was finished, and got up. By the time the first light was coming gray through the smokehouse's single window, she had the stove going, and 2 batches of bread dough rising under cloth, and a pot of coffee that she intended to drink most of before anyone else appeared to claim a share of it. She stood at the makeshift work table, 2 sawhorses, and a plank Emmett had found in the barn, which was not ideal but was functional, which was the only thing Rosa required of anything in her vicinity, and went through her fair preparation notes by lamplight. Molasses bread, sour cherry preserves, the ranch supper category, which she'd entered almost as an afterthought, and which she was now reconsidering seriously. The ranch supper category asked entrants to prepare a complete meal from frontier staples. Practical ingredients, what working families actually had. Rosa had spent most of her adult life feeding people on exactly those terms, and she knew, without false modesty, that she was very good at it. But knowing you're good at something and demonstrating it in a competition hall, with judges writing notes on clipboards, while Celestine Harrow's magnificently arranged table sits 6 feet away, were 2 different propositions. She added a note to her book. Practice the supper entry twice more before the fair. Time the preparation. Then she heard boots on gravel outside, and the smokehouse door opened and Wade came in, already dressed, carrying his own coffee cup as if he'd expected to find coffee here, which she reflected he probably had. Roof crew's coming back at first light, he said, sitting down at the end of the plank. Thorne's already out there. Already? Rosa glanced at the window. The gray outside had barely shifted. He didn't sleep much, Wade said. He said it without inflection, in the way he said most things, leaving the inference entirely to her. Rosa poured his coffee and didn't make the inference out loud. Wade drank and looked at the fair notes spread on the plank. He didn't comment on them. He was one of those rare men who could be in a room with someone working and simply be there without requiring acknowledgement or conversation. And Rosa had come to value this. The way you value a load-bearing wall, you don't always notice it, but you'd notice immediately if it were gone. What you said to Celestine at the Kellerman party, Wade said after a while. About the fair. Rosa kept writing. What about it? County's talking about it. I imagine they are. Some people think you were foolish to challenge her directly. Rosa looked up. What do you think? Wade considered this with the unhurried deliberation of a man who has learned that most questions benefit from being held for a moment before answering. I think Celestine expected you to either fight back small or not fight back at all, he said. And I think you did something she didn't have a plan for. He drank his coffee. Whether that's foolish depends on the preserves. The preserves are good, Rosa said. I know they are. He set the cup down. That's why I don't think you were foolish. She went back to her notes. Outside, she could hear the roof crew arriving voices, the sound of lumber being sorted, Thorne's low directions carrying across the yard without being raised. The gray outside the window was beginning to lighten. It was going to be another long day. Rosa pulled the breadcloth back, checked the rise, and started the second pot of coffee. Kitchen rebuild took 11 days. Not 3, not 5-11, because the damage was deeper than the initial collapse had suggested. When the crew got into the structure, they found that the section of roof that had come down had been pulling away from the main frame for longer than anyone had realized, and that the water damage to the wall behind the pantry was more extensive than the visible stain had indicated. Thorne stood in the kitchen on the 4th day, looking at what the crew had uncovered, and said nothing for a full minute, which was his version of swearing. We do it right, he said finally. We do it right, Rosa agreed. She had not been consulted on the original kitchen's design. It had been built years before she arrived, built for function, without much thought to the person who would spend 12 hours a day in it. But Thorne asked her now, standing in the skeletal frame of the rebuilt wall, what she needed. She told him. Larger pantry, better ventilation above the stove, 2 proper work tables instead of the single inadequate one that had been there before. More shelving, built at heights she could actually use without a step stool, because she was 5'4", and whoever had designed the original shelving had apparently been imagining someone considerably taller. Preserving area near the back door with good drainage. And a window. She wanted a window on the east wall, facing Lydia's orchard, because she had discovered over the past months that she thought better with light. Thorne wrote it down. He didn't argue about any of it. She found that surprising enough to mention it. I expected you to have opinions about the cost, she said. I have opinions about the cost, Thorne said. I also have opinions about doing it correctly the first time. He looked at the framing. This kitchen has been wrong since it was built. Lydia, he stopped. Rosa waited. Lydia said so, he finished more quietly. She never said it to me directly, but I heard her tell Wade once that the shelving was designed by someone who'd never cooked a meal in his life. He paused. She was right. Rosa looked at the east wall where the window would go. She sounds like she was observant, Rosa said carefully. She was. He didn't elaborate. He closed his notebook and put it in his pocket. I'll get the window framed by Thursday. He did it himself, Rosa noticed. Not because the crew couldn't have done it, because he wanted to. She didn't say anything about that either. In the smokehouse in the evenings after the men were fed and the day's work was done, Rosa practiced. She made the molasses bread until she could do it by feel, adjusting instinctively for the altitude variation she'd noticed affected the rise, until the loaves came out the same weight and texture every time. She worked the cherry preserves through 4 different batches, tasting and adjusting, adding a little more acid balance to the 3rd batch, and stepping it back slightly on the 4th. She needed the sweetness to sit forward and the tartness to come behind it, and she needed the set to be firm without being stiff, and she needed the color to hold sour. Cherries went brown fast if you weren't careful with the heat. Emmett Shaw ate the test batches without being asked and gave opinions without being solicited, which she found both useful and occasionally irritating. This one's better than the last one, he said one evening, looking at a jar of the 3rd batch. How is it better? Rosa asked, genuinely wanting the information. He thought about it. He was a serious thinker when he tried, which he didn't always try. The last one tasted more like cherry pie. This one tastes more like he struggled. More like a cherry, like you picked it off the tree. Rosa wrote that down. The last one was sweeter, she pressed. Yeah, the sweet kind of covered everything. He held the jar up to the lamp. This one, the sweet and the sour are both there at the same time. You get both. Rosa looked at her notes. That was exactly what she had been trying to describe to herself for 3 batches and couldn't find the language for, and a 19-year-old boy had found it in 40 seconds. You have a decent palate, she told him. Emmett looked genuinely startled, as if this was information that had never occurred to him as a possibility. I do? Don't let it go to your head, Rosa said. Taste this one. It was the middle of the rebuild, the 7th day, the kitchen half-framed, and the crew working on the east wall when Rosa heard the 2nd piece of information about Celestine Harrow. It came from Helen Kellerman, who came out to the ranch to return a preserving jar she'd borrowed and stayed to have coffee and look at the rebuild progress, which was exactly what Rosa suspected she'd come for, though Helen was kind enough that she didn't mind. Helen Kellerman was 53, broad and cheerful, with the social intelligence of a woman who had spent 30 years being the center of every community gathering and genuinely enjoyed it. She wasn't mean-spirited. She was, however, thoroughly informed. Celestine has brought in fruit from Helena, Helen said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. Had it shipped. Rosa looked at her. For the fair, Helen clarified. She's using Italian plums and French sugar, the decorative kind. And she's having new serving pieces made. She paused. People are talking. About the fruit, about the money. Helen set her cup down. There's some feeling that it's not quite in the spirit of a frontier county fair to import Italian plums. Some of the ranch wives are, she made a small gesture, pointed about it. Rosa was quiet for a moment. What did you use last year? She asked. Chokecherries, Helen said. From my own bushes. I came 4th. She didn't sound bothered by this. The year before, Edith Monroe took first with a sage honey preserve she'd been developing for 3 years. That's what this fair used to be. She looked at her cup. Celestine won with damson plum last year, the year before that with a sweet orange marmalade. They were beautiful, both of them. I don't think anyone could argue with the quality. She paused again. But they weren't something any family in this county could make. Rosa understood what Helen was telling her, without Helen saying it directly. My cherries came from the ranch orchard, Rosa said. Helen nodded, as if Rosa had confirmed something she'd already suspected. Lydia Blackwood planted that orchard, she said more quietly. Everyone in the county knew it. Everyone knew when Thorne locked the gate after she died. Rosa looked out the smokehouse window at the early morning light. The gate isn't locked anymore, she said. Helen looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her cup and finished her coffee and didn't say anything else. But her expression was the expression of someone who has received information they consider significant. It was Wade who found the evidence. He came to Rosa on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks before the fair, while Thorne was in town arranging lumber delivery. Wade sat at the plank table in the smokehouse and put a small metal fastener on the surface between them and looked at her steadily. This is from the roof section that came down, he said. Thread's been filed, not worn filed, done deliberately with a tool. Rosa looked at the fastener. It was small and ordinary looking, and the filed thread was not obvious to a quick glance. You would have had to know what you were looking for. There were 3 of them, Wade said, all from the same section. The section most likely to fail under ice load. He paused. Someone knew this roof, knew where to weaken it, or did enough preparation to figure it out, Rosa said. Wade nodded. Who had access to the property? Rosa asked. We're open range out here. Deliveries come and go. Hands from neighboring ranches stopped by. He turned the fastener in his fingers. But the section that failed, it's not visible from the yard. You'd have to know the ranch layout to find that specific section in the dark. Rosa thought about Celestine Harrow, about the confidence with which she had moved through the Kellerman parlor, about the particular quality of her smile, the smile of a woman who was accustomed to winning not just by being better, but by ensuring that the competition had a harder road. Thorne know? Rosa asked. Not yet. Wanted to tell you first. She looked at Wade. Why? He picked up the fastener and put it in his shirt pocket. Because whoever did this came after your kitchen, he said. That makes it your information first. He paused. What do you want to do with it? Rosa sat with that for a moment. She thought about going into the Coldwater Sheriff's Office with a filed roof fastener and an accusation against one of the county's oldest family names, and she thought about what that would look like the mail-order bride. The woman Celestine had mocked in public, arriving to accuse her antagonist of property sabotage. She knew exactly what story that would tell in a county that had spent 2 months deciding what to make of her. Not before the fair, she said. Save it. Document it if you can. But not before the fair. Wade looked at her without surprise. You don't want it to look like you're trying to disqualify the competition. I don't want anyone to think that's why I win, Rosa said quietly. If I win. When? Wade said, without drama, and stood up and left. Rosa sat alone in the smokehouse for a while, listening to the wind outside and the creak of the half-rebuilt kitchen taking the cold, and felt the weight of 11 days, of fear and work and sleeplessness settle onto her at once. She sat with it. She didn't try to put it away. Then she got up and checked the bread. Kitchen was finished on the 12th day, not the 11th. The window went in on the east wall the morning of the 11th, and Thorne stood inside and looked at where it was and said it was slightly off-center and spent an afternoon correcting it himself, which put the whole finish schedule back by a day. Rosa did not say anything about this, because the window was important to her and because watching Thorne Blackwood care about whether a window was properly centered was information she filed carefully away without examining too closely. When the kitchen was done, it was not the same room. The original had been functional in the grim, joyless way of a space designed by someone who considered cooking a problem to be solved rather than work to be done well. The rebuilt kitchen had the same bones, same location, same overall dimensions. Slightly larger pantry, but the proportions were better. The shelving was correct. The ventilation above the stove drew properly. And the east window threw morning light across the main work table in a way that Rosa stood in for a full minute the first time she entered, before she started putting anything away. Thorne was behind her. She didn't hear him come in, but she heard him stop. Turned. He was looking at the window, not with the expression of a man evaluating a construction job. With something more difficult than that. She would have liked that window, he said. Rosa didn't pretend not to know who he meant. I think she had good taste, she said. Thorne was quiet for a moment. You're not like I expected, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, it was an observation, stated with the same directness he applied to most things, slightly awkward because the context made it personal in a way he hadn't planned. What did you expect? Rosa asked. He thought about it with the honest deliberation she'd come to recognize. Somebody who needed rescuing, he said finally. Rosa looked at him for a moment. And instead, she said, he looked uncomfortable in the way men look when they've said something accurate that they hadn't entirely intended to say. Something else, he said. He turned and looked at the stove. You'll want to test the ventilation before the fair. Already planned to, Rosa said, and turned back to the shelving. She heard him leave. She let out a slow breath and looked at the east window and the pale November light coming through it. Something else. She was not going to build a story around that. She was absolutely not. She turned back to the shelving and started putting the preserves in order. The fair was in Coldwater, at the county hall on the second Saturday of December. Rosa was up at 3 a.m, not from anxiety, or not only from anxiety. The morning prep for a competition entry required timing, and her bread needed to come out of the oven at a specific moment, and that moment required a 3 a.m. start. She had learned over the previous weeks to stop apologizing to herself for how early she woke and simply get up and work, which was what she did. Emmett drove her into town in the ranch wagon. Thorne had offered to take her himself, and she'd accepted before realizing that having Thorne in the competition hall while she was trying to concentrate was a variable she wasn't sure she could manage. She had thanked him, suggested he follow with Wade and the rest of the hands later, and climbed into the wagon with Emmett and her entries wrapped in cloth and packed in a crate that she held on her lap the entire journey. You nervous? Emmett asked, about 10 minutes out of the ranch. Yes, Rosa said. He seemed surprised that she'd said it directly. You don't look nervous. I know, Rosa said. I've had a lot of practice not looking nervous. He thought about that. That's kind of a skill on its own, he said. It is, Rosa agreed. It is absolutely a skill. The county hall was already active when they arrived, tables being set up, other entrants bringing their entries in. The particular hum of a community event that has been organized for months and is now, finally, happening. Rosa carried her crate in herself and found her assigned table and set up without speaking to anyone, which was partly concentration and partly because she could feel people looking at her and she needed to not let that matter right now. Her table, she knew, looked ordinary. The molasses bread on a plain board. The sour cherry preserves in 3 jars. She'd decided on 3 after agonizing about it, because 3 allowed the judges to see consistency rather than luck. The ranch supper entry in the heavy iron pot she'd used since Ohio, a pot that had been through a kitchen collapse and a smokehouse relocation and still held heat perfectly. 6 tables down, Celestine Harrow's display looked like an event. Rosa didn't let herself look at it for more than a second. She straightened her breadboard and checked that the preserves were wiped clean around the lids and went to find the entry registration table. She was signing her name on the entry sheet when she heard Celestine's voice behind her. Rosa, pleasant, careful. I heard about the kitchen. What a terrible thing. Rosa finished signing and turned. Celestine was in a dark blue dress that had been made recently. Rosa could tell by the precision of the stitching, not the worn confidence of a garment that had been worn and lived in. She looked beautiful, and she knew it, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite the certainty it performed. We've recovered, Rosa said. Of course you have. Celestine smiled. You seem very resilient. The word was said with a particular inflection that made it mean something slightly other than its definition. Rosa had heard that inflection before, the tone that turns a quality into an accusation, that says resilient and means that kind of woman, the kind who has to be, because nothing comes easily to her. Rosa looked at her directly. I am, she said simply. Celestine held the look for a moment, then with perfect grace, well, may the best entry win. She turned and moved away through the hall, greeting 3 people by name before she reached her table. Rosa turned back to the registration sheet and wrote down her entry categories in her clear, even handwriting. Her hand was steady. The judges came through in the early afternoon. There were 4 of them, 2 women and 2 men from neighboring counties, brought in specifically because Coldwater County wanted the credibility of outside evaluation. Rosa knew this. She also knew that outside judges meant judges who did not know her name or her history or what Celestine Harrow thought of her arrival in Coldwater County. That, she decided, was a reasonable advantage. She stood to the side of her table while the judges worked through the entries, neither hovering nor retreating. When they reached her table, she answered their questions directly: how she'd grown the cherries, what she'd done with the molasses bread recipe, what her thinking had been on the ranch supper entry. One of the women judges picked up the cherry preserve jar and held it to the light. Color was right. Rosa knew the color was right. The balance between the deep red of the cherry skin and the slight translucence of the preserve indicated proper set and proper heat management, and Rosa had been looking at that color in lamplight at 3A. M for 11 consecutive practice sessions, so she knew it the way you know the face of someone you've been working alongside. The judge opened the jar and smelled it. Then she looked at Rosa with an expression Rosa couldn't fully read. "These cherries are from your ranch?" she said. "Lydia's orchard," Rosa said. "Fence line. The tree's been there 15 years. The judge wrote something in her notebook and moved on. Rosa exhaled slowly and went to get coffee. The results came in the mid-afternoon. The hall had filled by then ranch families, townspeople, children running between the display tables, the particular volume of a community assembled in a space too small for it. Rosa was standing with Emmett and 2 of the other Blackwood hands when Wade appeared through the crowd with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Bread took second," he said, without preamble. Emmett swore under his breath and then looked at Rosa and then at the floor. "Second is good," Rosa said. Her voice was steady. "What took first?" "Edith Monroe's sourdough. She's been making that loaf for 30 years. Wade looked at Rosa. Nobody was beating Edith Monroe's sourdough. "Fair enough," Rosa said. "What about the preserves?" Wade didn't answer immediately. Rosa looked at him. His expression had shifted into something she couldn't quite categorize. "Wade," she said. "First," he said. The word took a moment to land. Emmett made a sound beside her that was somewhere between a laugh and a yell, and drew immediate attention from the people standing nearest to them, which caused a small ripple of reaction through the hall as people turned to see what the commotion was, which caused Rosa to put her hand on Emmett's arm and say very quietly, "Stop." He stopped, but he was grinning. "First place," Rosa said, saying it out loud to make it real. "First place," Wade confirmed. "By a reasonable margin from what I heard." The judge said something about, he checked a small folded paper in his hand. "Balance of acid and sweetness, indication of quality fruit, and evidence of careful heat management." He folded the paper. "I don't know what most of that means." "It means the cherries were good and I didn't burn them," Rosa said. "Then yes," Wade agreed. That. Rosa stood with this for a moment. Around her, the hall continued its volume and movement, and the smell of 100 different food entries competing for attention. She looked across the hall at Celestine Harrow's table, where the Italian plums and the French sugar and the decorative serving pieces sat beautifully arranged and evaluated. She looked away. She didn't feel triumphant exactly. She felt something more complicated and more durable than triumph, the specific feeling of having worked very hard at something real and been told by people, with no stake in the outcome, that the work was good. She had not felt that in a long time. The ranch supper results came 30 minutes later, and they came in a way Rosa hadn't expected. One of the judges, the older man, who had said almost nothing to her when he'd come through the table, came to find her personally. He was a broad, practical man from Yellowstone County who looked like he had spent most of his life eating food prepared in exactly the conditions Rosa had described. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "A moment." Rosa went with him to a quieter part of the hall. "Your entry in the ranch supper category," he said. He was looking at her with a directness that was not unkind, but was entirely professional. "I want to make sure I understand what you submitted. You prepared this entire meal from provisions available on a standard working ranch. No specialty items." "That's correct," Rosa said. "The estimated cost per person?" 14 cents, Rosa said, "at current Coldwater County provision prices." He wrote that down. "And the yield?" "The entry serves 6. Scaled to 24 men, the total cost would be under 60 cents. He wrote that down too. He was quiet for a moment. We don't often see entries in this category from people who have thought about it that way, he said. Most people demonstrate cooking skill. You demonstrated, he paused, searching for the word. Economy. Genuine economy. Not as a limitation, as an intention. Rosa looked at him. Working families in this county need to eat well on what they have, she said. That's the category. That's what I entered. He nodded once. He didn't say anything else. He wrote a final note and thanked her, and walked back toward the judge's table. Rosa went to find Wade. She found Thorne instead. He had arrived with the second group from the ranch, as planned, and he was standing near the entrance with his hat in his hand and an expression that said he had been looking for her. When he found her, he crossed the hall directly. I heard about the preserves, he said. First place, Rosa said. Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite pride, something more surprise than pride, as if he had expected to hear this and was still somehow caught off guard by it. The bread? Second. To Edith Monroe. Nobody beats Edith Monroe's bread, Thorne said immediately. That's what Wade said. Wade's right. He looked around the hall. The supper results? Not posted yet. He nodded. He was still holding his hat. He was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has something he wants to say and is conducting an internal negotiation about whether to say it. Rosa waited. I should have fixed this kitchen properly 4 years ago, he said. She looked at him. He stopped. The internal negotiation, apparently, was not going entirely smoothly. The window, the shelving, all of it. Lydia told me the shelving was wrong and I meant to fix it, and then he didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. I should have fixed it regardless. Rosa considered this carefully. You fixed it now, she said. I know it's not the same thing, she said quietly. But you fixed it now. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read or could read, maybe, and had decided not to name. Around them, the hall volume shifted the kind of shift that means something is being announced, and they both turned. The judges were at the front table. Rosa moved through the crowd with Thorne just behind her. She found Wade and Emmett and the rest of the Blackwood hands clustered near the front left side of the hall, and she took her place among them and stood straight and quiet while the judges worked through the category results. The ranch supper result came third in the announcement. First place for finest example of practical ranch cooking submitted to this fair in recent memory. Demonstrated economy of means with exceptional quality of execution. The judge paused with the practiced timing of a man who knew he had a room's attention. Rosamond, Blackwood Ranch. The applause started with the Blackwood hands. Emmett was loudest, which surprised nobody. But it spread into the ranch families on the left side of the hall, into the groups of women who had been watching Rosa's table all afternoon, into pockets of the room she hadn't expected, moving outward from the Blackwood cluster like heat from a fire until it was the room and not just a section of it. Rosa stood in it. She did not cry. She was not, generally, someone who cried in public, and she was not going to start in the Coldwater County Hall with 20 ranch hands watching. But her throat tightened in a way that required deliberate attention to manage, and she kept her face forward and her eyes clear and stood straight in the applause of people who had never had any particular reason to applaud her before and were doing it anyway. Beside her, she felt Thorne's arm press briefly against hers. Just once. Just for a moment. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him, but she felt it. Celestine Harrow's preserves placed third. Rosa learned this quietly. From Helen Kellerman. Not from the announcement Celestine had left the hall before the full results were posted, with the controlled grace of a woman who had decided to process this information elsewhere. Helen told her the rest of it, too. The woman from the Helena fruit shop, Helen said. They were standing near the coffee table in the corner of the hall, away from most of the crowd. Margaret Dean. She worked for the Harrow family for 3 years, handled all their orders. She came to tell Sheriff Beaumont something this morning. Rosa looked at her. About the Blackwood roof, Helen said. Her voice dropped low. She said she was paid by a Harrow household account to arrange for someone to go out to the ranch. She doesn't know exactly who went or what was done, but she knows what the money was for. Rosa was very still. Came forward this morning? Rosa said. Apparently she'd been troubled about it for weeks, Helen said. And then she heard you'd still entered the fair, and Helen paused. She said she couldn't keep quiet anymore. Rosa set her coffee cup down. She thought about the filed fasteners Wade had shown her. The darkened section of roof, the moment she'd stepped back from the work table and heard the structure give way. 6 inches to the right, and the falling timber would have been a different story. She thought about Celestine Harrow's smile. She stood with all of it for a long moment in the noise and warmth of the county hall, while the applause from 10 minutes ago still seemed to ring faintly in her ears. What's going to happen to her? Rosa asked. The sheriff will determine that, Helen said carefully. But a paid account and a witness's testimony is significant. Rosa nodded. She picked up her coffee cup and looked across the hall at Celestine's empty table, the beautiful still perfectly in place, Italian plums and decorative serving pieces and French sugar, everything imported and lovely, and not quite good enough today. She felt tired, not the productive tired of hard work, but the bone-deep tired of a woman who has been fighting for her right to be exactly what she is since before she can clearly remember, and who wins occasionally, and who knows that winning doesn't end the fight, only moves it to different ground. Thorne appeared at her shoulder. Helen told you, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He was quiet. She could hear the particular quality of his silence, the one that meant he was holding something in with both hands. Thorne, she said. I know, she said. But it's not our decision. It's the sheriff's. Someone was on my property. I know. She looked at him directly. And there will be consequences. Real ones. But not tonight. She looked around the hall. Tonight, let me have this. He looked at her for a moment with that complicated expression she had stopped pretending not to be able to read. All right, he said. They stood side by side in the noisy warmth of the county hall, the widowed cattle rancher, and the woman he'd married for practicality, holding 2 first-place ribbons and information that was going to change things significantly by morning and didn't say anything else. Wade appeared from the direction of the food tables with a plate he had apparently assembled for himself, caught the quality of the silence between them, evaluated it with 40 years of practiced reading, and took his plate to talk to someone across the room. Rosa finished her coffee. Outside the county hall, through the walls, the December wind was picking up. It would be a cold drive back to Blackwood Ranch. She thought about the rebuilt kitchen, the east window, the morning light she hadn't seen yet because the window had been finished in the afternoon. She thought about the cherry tree in Lydia's orchard, standing bare in the winter, and the preserve she'd made from its fruit, sitting on a judge's table with a first-place ribbon. She thought about a lot of things, none of which she said out loud. She set down her cup, straightened her back, and went to find Emmett because it was time to start loading the wagon for the drive home. The drive back to Blackwood Ranch took an hour and 20 minutes, and Rosa spent most of it sitting in the wagon bed with her back against the side panel and the 2 ribbons in her lap and the cold coming through her coat in the particular way. Montana cold comes through things not gradually, but all at once, as if it has been waiting outside the warmth for its moment and takes it without ceremony. Emmett drove. He didn't talk much, which she appreciated. Occasionally, he would say something to the horses, and occasionally he would glance back at her with the expression of a young man who wants to say something celebratory and has correctly read that this is not the moment for it. Wade rode alongside on his horse, his coat collar up, saying nothing. Rosa looked at the ribbons, 1 blue, 1 red. Second place felt like a different thing tonight than it would have felt a year ago. Second place in a county fair she'd never entered for a ranch she'd never heard of would have been an abstraction. Tonight it sat in her lap, with the specific weight of 11 practice batches and a smokehouse and a 19-year-old boy, holding up a jar of cherry preserves to a lamp and saying the sweet and the sour are both there at the same time. She rolled the ribbons carefully and put them in her coat pocket. Behind her wagon, she could hear the Blackwood hands riding back in their loose cluster, talking the way men talk after a good day, not loudly, not about anything important, just the comfortable sound of people who have been through something together and don't need to discuss it in order to know that they did. Thorne rode at the back. Couldn't see him, but she knew it was him by the particular quality of hoofbeats that she had come to associate with his horse over the past months, a bay quarter horse named Grant, who was slightly heavy on the right fore, and who Thorne rode, with the absent ease of a man who has spent more hours on horseback than off. The ranch came into view a few minutes past the hour, the lamplit windows of the main house, the dark bulk of the barn, the outline of the rebuilt kitchen extension against the night sky. Rosa looked at it, the way you look at something you have worked on until it stopped being someone else's, and became, incrementally and without ceremony, yours. She climbed down from the wagon before Emmett came around to help and carried her crate to the kitchen door and went inside. The east window was dark. Of course, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and the light was long gone. But she stood in the rebuilt kitchen anyway and set the crate on the work table and looked around at the space she had designed from the inside out, and she felt the day settling onto her, the way hard days settle when you finally stop moving. She heard Thorne come in behind her. She didn't turn around. She started unpacking the crate, the empty breadboard, the cloth wrappings, the iron pot. "The sheriff will go to the Harrow property tomorrow," Thorne said. "I know. He came and spoke to me before we left the hall." A pause. Margaret Dean signed a statement. Rosa set the iron pot on the stove. "Will Celestine be formally charged? That's for Beaumont to determine. But the account records are clear. Money from a Harrow household account went to someone for work on the ranch. His voice was controlled in the way it got when he was managing something. On my property, at night, to damage your kitchen." Rosa turned around. Thorne was standing near the kitchen table, hat in his hand, with the look of a man who has spent the better part of an evening not saying what he wants to say. "I should have known earlier," he said. "There were signs before the roof. Things that didn't add up. Provisions that seemed off. Pantry lock that was wrong one morning." He stopped. "I didn't put it together." "Neither did I," Rosa said. "You were new. You didn't know the ranch." His jaw was working in that familiar way. "I knew it. I should have seen it." Thorne. She waited until he looked at her. "You can be angry. You should be angry someone was on your property in the night, doing deliberate damage. But you can't take responsibility for what Celestine Harrow decided to do. I could have protected. Nobody protects anyone from that kind of decision," Rosa said quietly. "The only person responsible for what Celestine did is Celestine." He was quiet. He was not entirely convinced. She could tell. He was the kind of man who carried responsibility the way some men carry weight constantly, without always examining whether he'd picked it up legitimately or just found it lying somewhere and assumed it must belong to him. "The kitchen is better than it was," Rosa said. She looked around the room. "The fair is done, and I won 2 ribbons, and the ranch hands came back from town, talking more than they have since I arrived. That's what the day produced." She looked at him. "Let that be enough for tonight." Thorne stood with this for a moment. Then he put his hat on the table and sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, not in the doorway, not at a distance, but at the table, in the room, like a man who had decided to be present somewhere instead of maintaining the distance he usually kept. Rosa made coffee. It was late, and they both had early mornings, and making coffee at 9 o'clock at night was not practical. She made it anyway, because the day had been long and the kitchen was new, and some nights the ritual of making something warm and simple is the only way to mark the end of something difficult without letting it just drop. She put a cup in front of Thorne and sat across from him. They drank coffee in the rebuilt kitchen, while the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds around them. And neither of them said anything particularly important, and that was, Rosa thought, exactly the right thing. December became January with the specific brutality that Montana reserves for transitions: no gradual cooling, no gentle adjustment. Just the temperature dropping 15 degrees overnight and staying there as if it had never intended to be anything else. The fallout from the Harrow situation moved through Coldwater County, like slow water, not explosive, but relentless. Sheriff Beaumont went to the Harrow property on the Monday, following the fair. He returned with documentation and a formal record of Margaret Dean's statement and a conversation with Festus Harrow, Celestine's older brother, that resulted in a private arrangement Rosa was never fully informed about, because it was county legal business and not her concern. What she knew was this: The Harrow family agreed to pay for the full cost of the kitchen reconstruction, plus damages, without the matter going to formal court proceedings. It was the kind of settlement that happens when old money meets clear evidence and decides quietly that admission through payment is preferable to exposure through trial. Celestine left Coldwater County in January. Rosa heard about it from Helen Kellerman, who came by twice a month now with preserving questions and stayed for coffee and brought county news without being asked, which Rosa had come to consider a reasonable trade. Her brother's family has a property in Oregon, Helen said. She's gone to stay with them indefinitely. She paused. People are saying she'll come back in the spring. People can say what they like, Rosa said, and poured more coffee. Helen smiled at her cup. I notice you're not asking what I think. I notice you're going to tell me anyway, Rosa said. Helen laughed. It was a real laugh, the unself-conscious kind. I think she won't come back, she said. Not because of the legal situation, the family has enough influence that won't follow her the way it should, but because Coldwater County has made up its mind about her, and Celestine Harrow has always needed people to think well of her. She set her cup down. And you won first place in preserves, with fruit from Lydia Blackwood's orchard, which everybody in this county knew Thorne had locked away for 4 years. That story has legs, Rosa. People are telling it. Rosa thought about the cherry tree in the winter orchard, bare-branched against the January sky. I didn't plan for it to be a story, she said. Most real stories aren't planned, Helen said. In late January, Wade came to Rosa with a different kind of problem. He found her in the preserving room off the kitchen, where she was cataloging the winter stores, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He always held his hat when he had something uncomfortable to say. She'd noticed and told her about the Garrity family. Thomas and Nell Garrity ran a small cattle operation 6 miles east of Blackwood Ranch. 2 children, a third on the way, a winter that had hit their provisions harder than expected. Thomas had a pride problem, the specific kind that makes men wait until they're nearly in crisis before asking for anything, and he'd finally sent word to Thorne, requesting to buy grain at cost, when he had no real means to pay for it until spring. Thorne said yes, Wade told her, obviously. Obviously, Rosa agreed. But Nell Garrity Wade stopped. She's been trying to stretch what they have, and she doesn't know how. Thomas said she's been rationing in ways that he shifted his weight, ways that aren't going to work. Rosa closed her catalog book. You want me to go out there, she said. I'm not asking you to. Wade. She looked at him. Yes or no? Yes, he said. She went out the next morning. Nell Garrity was 28 and trying to appear calm and not entirely succeeding. She was small and dark-haired, with the careful, watchful manner of a woman who had learned to manage more than she let anyone see. She met Rosa at the door, with the particular expression of someone who wants help and has not yet decided whether accepting it is a kind of defeat. Rosa had worn that expression herself. She recognized it from the inside. I'm not here to tell you what you're doing wrong, Rosa said, before Nell had to figure out how to phrase her welcome. I'm here because I learned some things about winter provisions the hard way last fall, and I thought you might want to compare notes. Nell looked at her for a moment. Then she opened the door wider and said, Coffee's on. They spent 3 hours in the Garrity kitchen. Rosa looked at what they had and did the arithmetic in her notebook, not the dramatic, urgent arithmetic of near disaster, but the steady, practical arithmetic of a woman who knows how to make things last. She showed Nell how to rework the grain stores into meals that would maintain the family's strength without burning through reserves too fast. She showed her 3 things to do with dried beans that the Garrity children would actually eat. She showed her the technique for extending a beef broth into 3 different meals over 2 days. Nell watched and wrote things down and didn't say much, which Rosa recognized as how some people learn. Before Rosa left, Nell caught her at the door. I heard about the fair, she said, and about what Celestine Harrow did. She stopped. I wanted to say Thomas and I have always known who Thorne Blackwood is. We know what kind of man he is, and now we know what kind of woman he married. She said it directly, without ornament. We're glad you're here. Rosa stood on the Garrity porch in the January cold and felt something land in her chest that she didn't entirely have a word for. Take care of that girl, she said, meaning the pregnancy, and Nell smiled and said she intended to, and Rosa drove the wagon back through the cold toward Blackwood Ranch. She didn't tell Thorne about the Garrity visit right away. It wasn't a secret she told him that evening when he asked where she'd been, and he listened and nodded and didn't make it into anything more than what it was. Thought about it. She could tell by the way he was quiet for slightly longer than usual afterward. 3 days later, he told her he'd arranged a credit line for the Garrity family at the Coldwater General Store against the spring cattle revenue without Thomas needing to ask for it. Rosa didn't say anything about this, but she noticed it. She was noticing a lot of things about Thorne Blackwood in January that she had not noticed in October or had noticed and filed away because she hadn't known what to do with them. The way he fixed things she hadn't mentioned needing fixing, as if he were doing a perpetual inventory of the ranch's condition that included, now, the things that mattered to her. The way he had started eating at the kitchen table instead of in the doorway, a shift so gradual she couldn't have named the exact day it changed. Only that one day she looked up from the breadboard, and he was simply there, at the table, with his coffee, as if he had always been. The way he talked to her now about the ranch not reporting, not directing, but actually talking, the way you talk to someone whose opinion you expect to find useful. She noticed all of this. She was doing her level best not to construct a story around it, and she was not entirely succeeding. In the middle of February, the second hardest thing happened. Not the hardest had already been the roof. The moment of standing in a destroyed kitchen, wondering whether someone had wanted to hurt her or merely wanted to stop her, and deciding it didn't matter, because in either case the answer was the same. The hardest had been made and survived. The second hardest was a conversation that happened in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening when the cold was so settled and complete outside that the ranch felt like its own world, with no particular connections, connection to anything beyond the fence line. Rosa was preparing the bread for the next morning. Thorne was at the table with the ranch ledgers, which he'd started bringing to the kitchen in the evenings without commenting on this relocation of his work habits. The lamp was between them. It was comfortable in the particular way that comfort gets when it has been established gradually and without announcement. Thorne closed the ledger and looked at it for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Not quite a question, the inflection of a man who has been negotiating with himself and has reached a provisional conclusion. "Yes," Rosa said. "When you came here," he stopped. Started again. "The advertisement, you answered it quickly." 10 days, Rosa said. "That's not particularly quick." "It is when you're agreeing to marry a stranger." He looked at the ledger cover. "I've wondered why." Rosa kept working the dough. She thought about how to answer this honestly without handing him more than he'd asked for. "I had $41 and a landlord's notice and 2 years of answering advertisements from men who wanted a woman to perform helplessness convincingly," she said. "Yours said no illusions offered." I believed that. "That's all?" He looked up. "That's most of it," she said. "The rest was..." She paused. "You said you needed someone who would stay. Not someone who would fit a particular picture. Just someone who would stay and do the work." She looked at the dough. "I know how to stay. I know how to do the work." Those felt like things I could actually offer. Thorne was quiet for a moment. "And the other advertisements?" "The ones before mine. What did they want?" "Mostly they wanted someone to be grateful," Rosa said. "Grateful in a specific way. The kind of grateful that doesn't ask questions or rearrange shelving or tell you the flour is bad." She said it without bitterness, just as information. "That's a reasonable thing to want, I suppose. It just wasn't something I could do." Thorne looked at her steadily. "You knew," he said. "When you arrived, you knew what this ranch probably thought of you, what they'd see. And you came anyway." "I also knew what I was worth," Rosa said. "Those two things can exist at the same time." He was quiet for a longer moment. "My first wife," he said. It was the direct opening she had not heard from him before, not oblique reference, not the carefully managed silence, but the direct opening. "Lydia." He stopped and began again with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing each word. "She was the kind of woman who made everything around her better by being in it. Not by effort, just by being the way she was." He looked at the lamp. "When she died, I thought the only way to honor that was to preserve it. Everything she'd touched. The way things were when she was here." He paused. I see now that what I actually did was stop everything from living. Rosa's hands were still on the dough. The garden, she said. The garden. The kitchen. Eating with my men. All of it. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. I thought keeping everything the same was a kind of faithfulness. Turned out to be a kind of... He didn't finish, Burial, Rosa said quietly. He looked at her. You buried yourself with her, Rosa said. And then you were surprised to find yourself in the dark. The lamp flickered once in a draft from somewhere and steadied. I'm not asking you to forget her, Rosa said. She had said this to him once before, in different form, in the wreckage of the collapsed kitchen. But this was different. This was direct. In the warm light of the kitchen she had built, with both of them awake and present and saying true things. I'm not competing with a memory. I wouldn't know how to do that, and I wouldn't try. She looked at him. But Thorne, the cherry tree is still alive. Lydia's orchard still produces. The things she built are still here. They're just allowed to keep going now. That's not forgetting her. That's letting her work mean something past the day she died. Thorne sat with this. For a long time he sat with it. Then he said, she would have liked you. Rosa didn't know what to do with that exactly. Turned back to the bread. I hope so, she said after a moment. She sounds like a woman worth earning the respect of. Thorne made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something in that direction, a sound she had not heard from him before. Short, genuine, slightly surprised at itself. She was, he said. She absolutely was. Rosa covered the bread and let it rest. March came slowly, the way March comes in Montana, promising things it doesn't immediately deliver, temperatures that rise for a week, and then drop again, as if reconsidering the commitment, snow that should be retreating but isn't quite yet. Emmett Shaw turned 20 in March. Rosa made him a cake, a proper one, the first cake she'd made since arriving, using the preserved fruit and the good sugar and the butter that had been put up from the fall churning. She put it on the kitchen table in the morning without announcement, and when Emmett came in for breakfast and saw it, his face in the thing young men's faces do when something surprises them past their ability to manage it. And he looked at the floor and said, "You didn't have to do that," in a voice that was quieter than his usual one. I didn't have to, Rosa agreed. I wanted to. He ate 2 pieces at breakfast, which she considered a successful outcome. That afternoon, sitting with his second cup of coffee after the morning work, Emmett said something Rosa hadn't expected. Can I ask you something? You can try, Rosa said. He turned the cup in his hands. He was thinking about how to phrase something. When you came here in October, the first day, I said something. He stopped. Rosa knew what he was referring to. She waited. I said something about how you looked, he said. He was looking at the table. I didn't think you heard me. I heard you, Rosa said. He nodded once, like he'd already suspected as much and had just confirmed it. I'm sorry, he said. He stopped again. I was stupid. I didn't know anything. You were 19, Rosa said. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed, it's not. But it's a fact. She looked at him steadily. You came in the rain and hauled lumber for my kitchen, Emmett. You ate my test batches and told me what was wrong with them. You were in the county hall applauding when the results came in. She paused. People aren't just one thing they said one time. They're everything they do after. He looked up from the table. He stopped himself. What? Rosa said. I was going to say generous, he said. But I think it might just be true. Both can be the case at once, Rosa said. Drink your coffee. He drank his coffee. After a moment, he said, Best birthday I've had in a while. And Rosa took that for the significant statement it was and didn't make too much of it. The letter came in the middle of March. It arrived addressed to Thorne, which was how letters generally arrived at Blackwood Ranch. But Thorne brought it to the kitchen and put it on Rosa's work table and stood back with his arms folded. And the expression on his face told her before she read it that the letter's contents were her business. It was from the Coldwater County Agricultural Committee. They had been discussing the result of the December fair, specifically the ranch supper category, specifically the judge's comments about economy and practicality, and the demonstration of genuine frontier cooking as a teachable skill. The committee wanted to know if Rosa Blackwood would be interested in conducting a series of practical cooking and preservation workshops at the county hall, open to ranch wives, homesteaders, and any interested county residents. She would be compensated for her time. The committee would supply the hall and the materials list. Rosa read the letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at the kitchen around her, the shelving she'd organized, the preserving room, the east window with March light coming through, it pale and thin but real. She thought about Nell Garrity's kitchen, and the 3 hours they'd spent going through provisions, and the look on Nell's face when she realized the beans she'd been undercooking could be stretched 3 different ways. She looked at Thorne. "They want teaching," she said. "Seems so," Thorne said. "I've never taught formally." "You taught me the supply arithmetic in a pantry in October," he said. "You taught Emmett about flavor in a smokehouse. You taught Nell Garrity 3 things about dried beans she didn't know." He looked at her. "What part of that isn't teaching?" Rosa picked up at the letter again. She thought about what it would mean traveling to town monthly, preparing instruction, working with women she didn't know in a hall that had recently watched her compete against Celestine Harrow. She thought about what it would cost in time and preparation, which was not nothing. She thought about what it would mean to the women who came. "I'd want to do it here," she said. "Not in town. Here in this kitchen." She looked around the room. "I want them to see what a working kitchen actually looks like when it's running properly. Not a demonstration space. The real thing." Thorne looked at her. "That's 20 women in my kitchen," he said. "Probably not 20 at once," Rosa said. "But in my kitchen. In our kitchen," she said, without thinking much about it. She heard the word after it was said and didn't take it back. Thorne's expression changed in some small specific way she filed carefully away. "All right," he said. She wrote back to the committee that afternoon. She would not use the county hall. She would conduct the workshops at Blackwood Ranch, in the ranch kitchen, starting the first Monday of April, open to anyone who needed them. She did not charge a fee. When Thorne saw the letter before she sealed it, he looked at the fee line and then at Rosa. "It's your time," he said. "I know, good." "I know," she said again. "But the women who need this the most are the women who can't spare what it would cost to pay for it." She sealed the envelope. "And I don't want to make it a transaction. I want it to be a kitchen." Thorne looked at the sealed letter for a moment. He didn't argue. He sent Emmett to town with it that afternoon. The night before the first workshop, Rosa couldn't sleep again. Not for the same reasons as before the fair, not fear exactly, not the remembered feeling of standing in a competition hall, aware of being watched and evaluated. This was a different thing, a more intimate nervousness. The fair had been about proving something to a room of strangers. This was about sitting in her own kitchen, with women who were going to trust her with their time and their attention, and the specific vulnerabilities that come with admitting you don't know how to do something you feel you should already know. She got up at 4. She went to the kitchen and stood in the east window's dark frame and looked out at the orchard just a shape in the darkness, trees bare, ground still carrying the last of the winter's snow in the shadowed places. She heard Thorne's door. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, not in night clothes, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either, or had gotten up early deliberately. He looked at her at the window and said nothing. "I'm nervous," Rosa said. "I know," Thorne said. "I'm not sure what's worse than the fair." He moved to the stove and put the kettle on. "At the fair, they were judging your preserves," he said. "Tomorrow, they're asking you to teach them. That's different." He found the coffee tin. "The fair was about what you made. Tomorrow is about who you are." Rosa turned from the window. That she stopped. "Accurate," he said. "Yes," she said uncomfortably. He made the coffee in silence, put a cup in front of her, sat at the table. "You know what you're doing," he said. "You knew when you walked into that kitchen in October and told me the flour was bad. You know now." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "The women coming tomorrow know something you don't know yet." "What's that?" Rosa said. "They already believe you're worth listening to," Thorne said. "You haven't lost that yet. You're just afraid you're going to." Rosa sat down across from him. She looked at him in the lamplight, the weathered face, the careful eyes, the man who had been managing his own private wreckage for 4 years before she arrived, and who was, slowly and with considerable difficulty, learning to be somewhere instead of merely near it. "When did you—" "Perceptive," she said, something almost like a smile. "I've always been perceptive," he said. I just usually don't say it. Why now? He considered this. Because you said it to me when I needed it, he said. In February. About Lydia. About the burial. He looked at his cup. Seemed fair. Rosa didn't say anything. They sat in the kitchen with their coffee in the dark before the dawn, and Rosa felt the nervousness still there. It hadn't gone anywhere, but it had settled into something she recognized as manageable, which was really all she could ask of it. Outside, the first faint gray of approaching morning was beginning to show over the eastern hills. The cherry tree in the orchard was just visible against it. Rosa watched it come light slowly, the branches coming out of darkness one by one, and thought about the 12 women who would be in this kitchen in 5 hours, and the things she knew that she could give them, and the things they knew that she hadn't learned yet. Thought about Nell Garrity's face, about the Garrity children eating beans prepared 3 ways, about the particular kind of usefulness that doesn't end when the work is done but keeps going, in other kitchens, in other women's hands, forward through time in directions you can't predict or plan. She finished her coffee. I need to start the bread, she said. Thorne stood, took both cups to the basin. I know, he said. I'll be out of your way. He left the kitchen. Rosa stood up and went to the shelvings and pulled down the flour and the salt and the molasses and laid them on the work table in the east window's growing light, and she started to work. She had 12 women coming at 8 o'clock. She was going to be ready. 12 women arrived in 1s and 2s, which Rosa had expected, and they stood in the yard outside the kitchen door in the April cold with the particular posture of people who have committed to something and are now reconsidering the commitment without any intention of actually leaving. Rosa opened the door before any of them knocked. Come in, she said. Coffee's ready and the stove is warm. They came in. She watched them take in the kitchen the rebuilt shelving, the 2 work tables, the east window with its April light, the organized pantry visible through the open connecting door. She watched their faces make small adjustments, the way faces adjust when reality differs from expectation. She wasn't sure what they'd expected. Something more formal, perhaps. Or something more modest. The kitchen was neither. It was a working space in full operation, bread already proving under cloth on the far table, preserving jars lined on the shelf in order of contents. Rosa's notebook open on the near table, beside a stack of blank paper she'd put out for them to write on. Nell Garrity was there, which Rosa had known she would be. She'd sent word herself. Nell came in last, a little behind the others, with the careful look of a woman carrying a secret, which Rosa understood. After a moment was the pregnancy, now visible enough that Nell had stopped concealing it behind her coat. She met Rosa's eyes across the kitchen, and Rosa nodded once, which Nell returned, and that was the entirety of the greeting they needed. Helen Kellerman was there, which Rosa had also expected. Helen settled into the kitchen with the ease of a woman at home in any room she enters, and immediately started talking to the woman beside her, which relieved some of the standing tension that comes with 12 strangers in an unfamiliar space. The others Rosa didn't know by name yet, though she recognized 2 faces from the county hall in December. Ranch wives, mostly. One young woman who couldn't have been more than 22, standing near the door with her coat still on and her hands twisted together in front of her. One older woman, somewhere past 60, with the roughened hands of someone who had been doing hard physical work for most of her life and hadn't expected to be taking instruction from anyone. Rosa looked at them and thought about what Thorne had said at 4 in the morning. They already believe you're worth listening to. She held on to that without examining it too closely, because if she examined it, she'd start doubting it, and she didn't have time for that right now. My name is Rosa Blackwood, she said. Most of you know that. I'm going to tell you what we're doing today, and then we're going to do it, and if you have questions, ask them while we work, because the bread won't wait for a question and answer period. A small laugh from somewhere in the group. The tension shifted. Today we're starting with bread, Rosa said. Not because it's simple, it isn't. Because everything else in winter provision management depends on understanding flour, and you can't understand flour without making it into something. She moved to the far table. Get close enough to see what I'm doing. I'll explain as I go. They moved closer. The older woman with the roughened hands moved closest, which Rosa noted. She had expected her to hold back. Rosa pulled back the cloth on the proving dough. This has been rising for 2 hours, she said. I want you to look at it. Not touch it yet, look. They looked. What do you see? Rosa asked. Silence for a moment. Then the young woman near the door, still in her coat, said quietly, It's doubled. It's doubled, Rosa confirmed. That's what properly proved bread looks like. Now, I want each of you to think about the last time your bread didn't rise the way you expected. Don't answer out loud, just think about it. Because by the end of this morning, most of you are going to know what went wrong. The workshop ran 4 hours. Not the 3 Rosa had planned, because questions happened. The way questions happen when people are actually learning something, not at the scheduled moment, but at the moment the information connects to something they already know and produces a collision they need to resolve out loud. The older woman, her name was Dorothea Krause, she'd been ranching outside Coldwater for 31 years, stopped Rosa in the middle of the bread-kneading demonstration and said, The altitude. You said the altitude affects the rise. My bread has been wrong for 30 years and nobody ever told me it was the altitude. Partly the altitude, Rosa said. What flour are you using? Whatever the general store has. Is it always the same? Dorothea paused. No, she said slowly, they change suppliers. Different suppliers mill to different consistencies, Rosa said. Different consistency means different absorption. Different absorption means different rise time. If your flour changed and your recipe didn't, your bread would change. She looked at Dorothea. Has the store changed suppliers in the last few years? Dorothea's expression was the expression of someone doing arithmetic that should have been done 30 years ago. Twice, she said. Maybe 3 times. There's your bread, Rosa said. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the directness of a woman who has earned her opinions through decades, I wish someone had told me that when I was 20. So do I, Rosa said. Write it down and tell your daughters. Dorothea wrote it down. Beside her, Helen Kellerman was already on her 3rd page of notes and had started annotating with small arrows and margin comments. The young woman, Clara, she'd said her name was, newly married. Her husband, running a small homestead 8 miles north, had taken off her coat somewhere in the 2nd hour and was kneading a practice piece of dough with the concentrated ferocity of someone who has decided to understand something fully or not at all. Nell Garrity sat at the end of the work table with her feet elevated on a spare stool because Rosa had quietly arranged the stool and told her to use it without making it a discussion. And she was writing in neat, careful script and occasionally asking a question that revealed she had been thinking ahead to the next topic before Rosa got there. By noon, 12 women had made bread, discussed flour suppliers, debated the merits of 3 different preserving seals, and argued constructively about whether lard or beef fat produced a better pie crust in high altitude. The argument about pie crust went on for 20 minutes and was not resolved, which Rosa considered an excellent outcome, because unresolved questions are the ones people keep thinking about. When they left, they did not leave quietly. They left talking to each other. Comparing notes, Clara and a woman named Judith, who ran a sheep operation, were deep in a conversation about grain storage that showed no signs of ending, even as they put their coats on. Helen was already proposing a session to Dorothea, who was listening with the cautious openness of a woman, reconsidering whether instruction is a kind of defeat. Nell was the last one out. She stopped at the door and looked back at Rosa. Same time next month, she said. Same time next month, Rosa said. After they were gone, Rosa sat down in the kitchen for the first time since 4 in the morning and drank a cup of cold coffee because she hadn't had the chance to drink it warm, and felt the particular satisfied exhaustion of a morning that had gone the way it was supposed to go, not perfectly, not without friction, but honestly, with real people doing real work and going home knowing something they hadn't known before. She heard Thorne come in from the yard. He looked at the kitchen, the flour on the work tables, the used bowls, the pages of notes a few women had left behind in the rush of leaving, the empty coffee cups. How did it go? He said. Rosa finished the cold coffee. Good, she said. Dorothea Krause found out why her bread has been wrong for 30 years. Thorne raised an eyebrow. 30 years? Flour supplier, consistency, and altitude, Rosa said. She took 3 pages of notes. He looked at the tables. You'll need more work table space if the group gets larger, he said. Rosa looked up from her cup. You think it'll get larger? Dorothea Krause talks to everyone in this county, Thorne said. Yes, I think it'll get larger. He was right. By the May workshop, there were 19 women in the kitchen. Rosa had rearranged the furniture and borrowed a table from the bunkhouse, which caused a brief negotiation with the ranch hands about the table's return that Wade mediated with the seriousness he applied to all ranch logistics. Table came back after the workshop with a note from Clara thanking the men for the use of it, which Emmett read twice and then pinned to the bunkhouse wall, which Rosa chose not to comment on. The May session focused on summer-preserving timing, preparation, the difference between what preserved well and what people thought would preserve well. Rosa had made a list of the most common preserving mistakes she'd seen over her years of working in other people's kitchens, and she went through the list without any ceremony, the way you go through a list of facts. And the room of women listened with the concentrated attention of people recognizing their own past errors in someone else's accounting. At the end of the session, Judith the sheep rancher, who had turned out to be formidably practical and had become something like a discussion co-leader in the group, fielding questions Rosa directed to the room, raised something Rosa hadn't anticipated. There are women who can't come here, Judith said. On the Far East properties, it's half a day's ride. With children, it's not possible. She looked around the room. Could we take what we're learning there? Rosa looked at her. You mean teach it yourself, Rosa said. I mean use what you've given us, Judith said. Take your notes. Use your recipes. Go to the women who can't come to you. The room was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that means everyone is thinking the same thing and waiting to see who says it. Rosa thought about this, about what it would mean for what she'd started here to move beyond the walls of this kitchen, to go out into the county in the hands of women like Judith and Clara and Dorothea and Nell, who would carry it imperfectly and specifically, and with all the particular variations of their own experience. And that would make it better, not worse, because useful knowledge changes hands and changes in the changing, and that is how it stays alive. Yes, Rosa said. Judith nodded once, with the satisfaction of a woman who had expected this answer and is glad to have received it. I'll write up the core notes properly, Rosa said. Organized, with measurements and common variations. You can copy them. She paused. But you come back here and tell me what works differently at the East properties. The altitude might be different. The flour might be different. I want to know. We'll tell you, Clara said from the back of the room. It was June when Thorne put Rosa's name on the property documents. He did it without announcement, the way he did most things of significance, not dramatically, not as a gesture demanding acknowledgement, just as a fact. He came to the kitchen one evening with a paper from the Coldwater County Land Office and set it on the table in front of her. Rosa looked at it, her name, beside his. On the house, the orchard acreage, the surrounding property. She looked up at him. You didn't have to do this, she said. I know, Thorne said. He was standing with his arms at his sides. Not folded, she had learned to read the difference. Folded meant managed distance. Arms at his sides meant present, without armor. You've been running this property since October. The kitchen is yours. The orchard is yours. You unlocked that gate, and I wasn't going to have the deed not reflect it. Rosa looked back at the paper. Thorne, there's something else, he said. She looked up again. He reached into his shirt pocket and put a key on the table beside the paper. Iron, old, slightly heavy. She had never seen it before, but she understood what it was, the original house key. The one that had existed before everything she'd known about this place. The one that had hung in Lydia's hand and before that in whoever had built this house. This belonged to the owner of the house, he said. Rosa looked at the key for a long moment. Then she reached for it and picked it up and held it out to him. Then you should keep it, she said. Thorne closed her fingers around it. Both hands around hers, briefly rough and warm and certain. I am, he said. Rosa looked down at her closed hand. She stood very still for a moment, in the June evening light coming through the east window, with a property deed and an iron key, and the particular feeling of being seen clearly by someone who had all the information and was making a choice anyway. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The summer brought work, of the kind that doesn't stop the orchard needing attention, the preserving season starting. The monthly workshops expanding to accommodate women Rosa hadn't met yet, who were arriving from further reaches of the county on the recommendation of women who'd been coming since April. Kept her notebook current, adding observations from each session, and in the evenings, she and Thorne sometimes sat at the kitchen table after supper, and she would read him things from it, and he would offer information from the ranch ledgers in return. And it had become a specific kind of evening that she looked forward to, without having named it to herself as a thing she looked forward to. Wade saw everything. The way Wade saw everything, and said nothing. The way Wade said nothing. Emmett saw everything and managed to say nothing about it for 3 full weeks before he told the other ranch hands in the bunkhouse, which Rosa became aware of when 3 of them started finding reasons to finish work early enough to be visibly occupied near the kitchen during what had become a recognizable hour, which caused her to feel simultaneously annoyed and something she couldn't quite label that was not entirely annoyance. In August, the orchard produced. The cherry tree that Thorne had locked away for 4 years and Rosa had unlocked in February, and they had both worked to save in the storm that tree, Lydia's tree, the one planted in the first year of a marriage that had ended too soon, produced better than it had in years according to Wade, who remembered every season of the ranch's fruit production, the way some men remember cattle numbers. Rosa was in the orchard. The first morning she noticed the cherries were ready. She'd come out early, before the workshop preparation, to check the progress. And she stood in the orchard in the August morning light and looked at the loaded branches and thought about a woman one never met who had planted this tree and who had known it was in the wrong place to be locked away and forgotten. She heard the gate. Thorne. He came into the orchard without saying anything and stood beside her looking at the tree. She planted this from a seedling, he said, carried it from her family's property in Wyoming. 3 days on the stage, he looked at the loaded branches. She said a ranch without an orchard was just land. She was right, Rosa said. He looked at the tree for a long moment. When I locked this gate, I told myself I was protecting it, keeping it the way she'd left it. He paused. I was actually just making sure nobody could see it change. Change is hard to watch when you love something, Rosa said. I know, he looked at her. I know that now. Rosa reached up and picked one cherry from the nearest branch. She held it in her palm, small, dark red, slightly imperfect the way all the best fruit is imperfect. This is going to be a good batch, she said. Better than last year, Thorne agreed. Rosa looked at the cherry in her palm. She thought about a jar of preserves on a judge's table with a first-place ribbon. She thought about the orchard gate being unlocked in February, in the cold, while Thorne stood a few feet away, not quite able to do it himself. She thought about all the distances between October and now, not just the months, but the actual distances, the ones measured in conversations and cold mornings and kitchen rebuilds and faith given in small denominations over time. Thorne, she said, yes, I need to ask you something. He turned to face her properly. His arms were at his sides. The advertisement, she said. When you wrote it. When you wrote no illusions offered. What did you actually expect? Not what you said you expected. What you actually expected. He thought about this with the honesty she had come to rely on him for, the kind that doesn't rush to the comfortable answer but goes looking for the true one. Someone competent, he said. Someone capable. Someone who would do the work without needing the ranch to be something it isn't. He paused. Someone I could respect without it being complicated. And instead, Rosa said, he looked at the cherry tree. Complicated, he said. Rosa looked at him. In what way? She said. He looked at her then directly, without the managed distance, without the careful control he used on his expressions the way he used it on the ranch. Just looking at her, in the orchard, in the August light, with all of it plain. In every way, he said. Rosa looked back at him. She had spent 8 months not building stories around Thorne Blackwood. 8 months of filing things away carefully, telling herself she wasn't drawing conclusions, and maintaining a sensible, practical understanding of what their arrangement was. She had been quite disciplined about it. She found, standing in the orchard with a cherry in her palm, that she was finished being disciplined about it. I think, she said carefully, that when you said this ranch was hungry, you might have meant more than the kitchen. Thorne was quiet for a long moment. I know I did, he said. I just didn't know it yet. Rosa closed her hand around the cherry. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The orchard was full of summer morning sounds birds, the wind in the branches, the distant noise of the ranch coming to life. It was not a quiet moment in the way silence is quiet. It was quiet in the way that very full things are quiet, when there isn't anything to add. After a while, Rosa said, "I need to start the preserving." "I know," Thorne said. He stepped back to let her pass. She walked back toward the kitchen, and she was halfway to the gate when she heard him say her name. Turned. He was still standing by the tree. "The first day," he said. "When you arrived, and you looked me directly in the eye." He paused. "I'd forgotten what that felt like. Someone looking directly at you, without deciding first what they were going to see." Rosa stood at the orchard gate. "I saw a man who needed his household run," she said. "That was all I knew to see." "That's what I mean," Thorne said. She went through the gate and walked back to the kitchen, and she did not look back, because she didn't trust herself to look back right now, and she had cherries to process, and a workshop to prepare, and a morning that was not going to wait. But she was smiling. She wasn't going to pretend she wasn't. The August workshop was the largest, yet 23 women, which meant borrowing both of the bunkhouse tables and reorganizing the kitchen entirely, which the ranch hands contributed to with the particular energy of men who have decided that something happening near them is their business. Emmett moved furniture for 2 hours without being asked. Wade supervised, which meant standing in the doorway with his coffee and occasionally saying left or back a foot in ways that were rarely necessary, but seemed to make him feel useful. Thorne disappeared for the morning to give the kitchen over to its purpose, which Rosa had not asked him to do but which she appreciated. The August session focused on winter preparation, the full accounting of a household's provisions, how to assess what you had against what you would need, how to build a supply plan that assumed bad luck rather than hoping for good. It was the arithmetic Rosa had done in Thorne's pantry in her first week, translated into something teachable, stripped of the urgency that had driven her original calculations and replaced with the steady practicality of a skill you build before you need it. Dorothea Krause came back, which Rosa had hoped for. Came with a woman she'd brought from the far end of the county, a widow named Agnes, who ran her late husband's cattle operation alone, and who sat at the work table with the compressed energy of a woman who has been managing too much for too long, without adequate tools and has recently discovered there might be tools. Agnes didn't say much through the first 2 hours. She wrote. She wrote more than anyone else in the room, in a cramped, urgent script, and she asked 3 questions that were the best questions asked all morning because they were the questions of someone who had been making decisions in the dark and was now demanding light. During the noon break, when most of the women were eating in the yard in the August warmth, Agnes stayed at the work table and worked through something in her notebook. Rosa brought her coffee and didn't make it a conversation. Agnes looked up. "This," she said, tapping her notes. "The supply calculation. If I'd had this 3 winters ago," she stopped. "How bad was it?" Rosa said. "Bad enough." Agnes looked at her notes. "I sold 2 horses to cover a grain shortfall in February. Horses I needed." She set the pencil down. "One decision wrong because I didn't know how to count forward properly." "You know now," Rosa said. "I know now," Agnes repeated. She said it quietly to herself as much as to Rosa. Then she picked up the pencil again and went back to her calculations. Rosa left her coffee and went back to the work table to start the afternoon session. After the August workshop, after the women had gone, and the borrowed tables were back in the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was restored to its daily order, Emmett appeared in the doorway with an expression Rosa had learned to recognize, the expression of someone who has information they've been instructed not to share and are failing at the restraint. "What?" Rosa said. "Nothing," Emmett said. She looked at him. Wade said. Never mind what Wade said. "Nothing. Emmett." He shifted his weight. "The county committee," he said. They wrote to Thorne again. About the workshops. He was looking at a point slightly above Rosa's head. "They want to make it official. A county program. With a name and everything." Rosa set down the cloth she was folding. "A county program. Yeah." Still looking at the ceiling area. "They want to call it," he stopped again. "What do they want to call it?" Rosa said. Emmett finally looked at her. The Blackwood Kitchen, he said. That's what they proposed. The Blackwood Kitchen program. He paused. Wade said you probably wouldn't like that. Why did Wade say that? He said you'd think it was Thorne's name on your work. He paused. Is that what you think? Rosa considered this for a moment. She thought about the name. Blackwood Kitchen. She thought about what the name meant, not just Thorne's name, but hers too, because she was a Blackwood now, and the kitchen was hers in every sense that mattered, and maybe the name was less about ownership than about location, less about whose work it was than about where the work happened. She thought about Lydia's cherry tree. Tell Wade, Rosa said, that I think the name is fine. Emmett looked surprised. Then he nodded and turned to go. Emmett, Rosa said. He stopped. Tell Thorne first, she said. Before you tell anyone else. He nodded again and left. Rosa stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. The east window was showing the late afternoon light long in gold, the particular light of August evenings in Montana, which sits different from every other kind of light because of the angle and the altitude and something else she'd never been able to name exactly, only recognize. She had arrived in this kitchen in October with blistered hands and $41 of history and a clear-eyed understanding of what she was capable of and no particular certainty that anyone would ever see it. She had rebuilt the kitchen once after neglect and once after sabotage, and she had filled it with women learning things they'd needed for years, and she had put up enough preserves to last the winter, and she had unlocked an orchard gate, and she had made a man who had been living in careful managed darkness remember how to be in a room without standing in the doorway. She didn't think of any of this as victory. She thought of it as work. The difference between those two words was something she'd spent 32 years learning, and the lesson was this: victory ends, and work continues, and the work is the thing worth having. She heard Thorne's boots in the yard. He knocked on the kitchen door frame, which he didn't usually do. He usually just came in, and she understood from the knock that Emmett had found him quickly. Come in, she said. He came in. He was carrying his hat. He looked at her and then around the kitchen and then back at her. Emmett told me, he said. I thought he might. You're all right with the name. Blackwood is my name too, Rosa said simply. He stood with that for a moment. Something moved in his expression that took up residence and didn't leave. There's something else, he said. Another letter from the committee? No. He turned the hat in his hands. I've been trying to find the right time to say something for approximately 4 months, and I've decided the right time doesn't exist and I'm going to say it anyway. Rosa looked at him. I'm in love with you, Thorne said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered directly, without flourish, without hedging, looking at her straight. I don't know exactly when it happened. I know it wasn't one thing. I know it was everything. The way you work, the way you talk to people, the way you said Lydia would have liked you, and then I thought about it, and I knew you were right, and He stopped. It broke something loose in me that I didn't know was still locked. Rosa was very still. I'm not asking you to feel the same way, he said. I know this arrangement started as practical, and I know I don't have any minds. Thorne, Rosa said. He stopped. I've been not building a story around you for 8 months, she said. It has been very hard work. He looked at her. I'm tired of not building it, she said. Kitchen was very quiet. Thorne crossed the room in the particular way he moved when he had decided something and was done deciding without hesitation, without performing the decision, just moving toward what he'd already settled in himself. Stopped in front of her. He was still holding the hat. Rosa, he said. Yes, she said. He put the hat on the table and took her flour-dusted hands in both of his and held them. They stood like that in the August evening light from the east window, in the kitchen she had built and he had helped build, and that had been built again after someone tried to destroy it. And neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything adequate to say, and they had both spent enough of their lives saying things that weren't adequate to fill silences that could have been left alone. After a while, Rosa said, The preserves need checking. I know, Thorne said. He didn't let go of her hands. She didn't pull them back. Outside, through the window, the last of the August light was sitting on the cherry tree's branches in a way that made the whole orchard look like something that had always been meant to be open, always meant to be producing, always meant to be seen. Rosa looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, The preserves can wait. And Thorne laughed, a real one, the unself-conscious kind she had been waiting 8 months to hear, and she felt it land in her chest and stay there. Warm and permanent, the way things stay when they finally arrived, where they were always going. The preserves did eventually get checked. It was Rosa who broke away first, not because the moment had ended, but because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving something on the stove unattended for longer than her conscience permitted. And Thorne had laughed again, the second real laugh in 10 minutes, which was 2 more than she'd heard from him in the previous 8 months combined, and let her go check the preserving jars with the particular expression of a man who has said something true and had it received well, and is still slightly surprised by his own relief. The jars were fine. Of course they were fine. She had been managing preserving operations since she was 12 years old, and she knew exactly how long she had before the seals needed checking. But standing at the preserving shelf in the August evening, running her thumb across the jar lids and listening to the sound the kitchen made when it was full and warm and running correctly, she needed the familiar ritual the way you need something ordinary after something large. She heard Thorne move to the table behind her, the sound of a chair. The specific quiet that had become their specific quiet over 8 months, not empty, not waiting, just the comfortable presence of 2 people in the same room without the room feeling crowded. "Committee letter," Thorne said, "about the program name. I want you to know I didn't suggest it." "I know," Rosa said. "I wouldn't have presumed, Thorne." She turned around. "I know, and I told Emmett I was fine with it, and I meant it." She looked at him. "Blackwood is my name. The kitchen is mine. The name fits." He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped trying not to read. "All right," he said. She turned back to the shelf. "You should know," she said, "that Agnes Patterson, the widow Dorothea, brought in August. She's coming back next month. And she's bringing 4 women from her area that can't travel to the county hall." "How many does that make?" 28, Rosa said. "Possibly 30. Thorne was quiet for a moment. "We'll need the barn table." "I was thinking the same thing. I'll have Emmett clean it." "Tell him before he hears about it from someone else," Rosa said. "He takes it personally when he's the last to know things." From somewhere outside, as if on cue, they heard Emmett's voice in the yard telling one of the other hands something with considerable enthusiasm, and then laughter. Rosa and Thorne looked at each other. "He already knows," Thorne said. "He always already knows," Rosa said. September came in with the particular smell of a Montana autumn, something between cut grass and cold stone, and the particular dryness of air that has started to prepare itself for what's coming. Rosa knew the smell by now. She'd learned the ranch's seasonal vocabulary over the months the way you learn a language when you live inside it, not by study but by immersion, by the gradual replacement of strangeness with familiarity, until one morning you realize you understand what the weather is going to do, 3 days before it does it. The September workshop brought 31 women. They overflowed the kitchen into the yard, which Rosa had anticipated by setting up the barn table outside with a canvas shade, and the day was warm enough to make this workable if not comfortable. And nobody complained because the women who came to the Blackwood kitchen workshops had self-selected for practicality over comfort, in the same way Rosa had been self-selected for it by a lifetime of necessity. Agnes Patterson came with 5 women, not 4. She also came with a notebook that was almost completely full, and a series of questions about winter root vegetable storage that suggested she had been thinking about this continuously since August. Rosa went through the questions one by one. Dorothea Krause ran the bread demonstration for the second half of the morning, which Rosa had asked her to do 2 weeks before, and which Dorothea had initially refused on the grounds that she had been making bread wrong for 30 years and was in no position to teach it. Rosa had pointed out that Dorothea had been making bread correctly for the past 4 months, and that the women who most needed to hear that turd altitude and flour consistency mattered were the women who'd been making the same mistake Dorothea had made, and that Dorothea could explain that mistake from the inside in a way Rosa couldn't. Dorothea had eventually said yes, with the reluctant precision of a woman who has been outmaneuvered by a sound argument and knows it. She was an excellent teacher. She was gruff and direct, and she didn't soften the information or apologize for the difficulty of it. And the women in the yard listened to her the way people listen to someone who has earned their knowledge through genuine experience. When she demonstrated the dough texture and said, "This is what it should feel like, I know, because I got it wrong for longer than some of you have been alive," the yard went very quiet, and then someone laughed. And then everyone laughed, and then they got to work. Rosa watched from the kitchen doorway with her coffee and felt something she was still learning to name, a kind of satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of doing something well herself. Bigger, somehow, less personal and therefore less fragile. When Wade appeared at her elbow, also with coffee, also watching Dorothea demonstrate bread technique to 31 women in the September yard, she said, "Don't say anything." "I wasn't going to say anything," Wade said. "You had a look." "I always have a look," Wade said. "That doesn't mean I was going to say anything." They stood in the doorway together for a moment. "You did good here," Wade said finally. He said it the way he said most things, without ornamentation, as information rather than compliment. "We did good here," Rosa said. Wade considered this. "Fair," he said, and went back to his coffee. The formal county committee recognition came in October. Exactly 1 year after Rosa had stepped off the stagecoach at Blackwood Ranch with a trunk and $41 and the particular expression of a woman who has decided to stop being apologetic about what she is. The letter from the committee was longer than the first one and more official in its language, which Wade read aloud at the kitchen table, in the voice he used for county correspondence, flat and slightly ceremonious, as if the formality of the document required a formality of delivery. The committee formally recognized the Blackwood Kitchen Program as a county resource. It acknowledged the contribution to agricultural household management and winter provision planning. It noted the program's reach 43 women from 11 different properties by the October count, with instruction extending to remote areas through the network that Judith and Clara and Agnes had built over the summer. 43 women. Rosa sat with that number for a while. She thought about the 12 women who had stood in her kitchen yard in April, not quite sure whether to come in. She thought about Nell Garrity's carefully elevated feet, and Agnes Patterson's full notebook, and Dorothea Krause teaching bread in September with the earned authority of someone who has stopped being ashamed of what she didn't know and started using it. She thought about Clara, who had written Rosa a letter in August, saying that her husband had asked what had changed in their kitchen, and Clara had told him she'd been taking instruction, and he had said the bread was different, and Clara had said yes, and then asked him if he would like to learn why, and he had said he would, and they had spent an evening going through Rosa's notes together, which Clara described as the most useful conversation she and her husband had ever had. Rosa had read that letter 3 times. 43, Emmett said from the far end of the table. He had been present for the reading of the letter in the way he was increasingly present for things that happened in the kitchen, not intrusively, but with the persistent proximity of a young man who had decided this was where the important things happened, and he intended to be nearby when they did. "You're supposed to be mending fence," Wade told him, "without heat." "Fence can wait," Emmett said. Wade did not argue this. Rosa set down the letter. "The committee wants response," she said. "About the program's continuation." "What kind of response?" Thorne asked. He was at the table with his own coffee. He was almost always at the table now. Rosa had stopped noticing it as an event and started noticing it only when he wasn't. "They want to know if we'll continue, and if we want the formal recognition, the county listing, the official record." She looked at the letter. "It would make it easier for women to know about it, to find it." "Then yes," Thorne said. "Simply. Means more women on the property," Rosa said. "More mornings like this. More borrowed tables." "I know what it means," Thorne said. Rosa looked at him. "I built the kitchen to your specifications," he said. "I think we both knew it wasn't only going to be for 24 ranch hands." Rosa picked up the letter and started composing the response in her head. Yes to the continuation. Yes to the formal recognition. One condition: the program would remain at the ranch, in the actual working kitchen, because that was the point of it. Not a demonstration space. The real thing. She wrote it that afternoon. Emmett took it to town on his way to get supplies, which meant it arrived at the committee office an hour and a half faster than it would have otherwise, which was unnecessary but characteristic. Cherry harvest was in October. Rosa went into the orchard on the first morning of it with her picking baskets, and found Thorne already there, not helping exactly. Not yet. But standing by Lydia's tree with his hand on the bark, in the particular way she'd seen him stand near things that mattered to him. The standing that isn't quite touching and isn't quite letting go. To it. She started on the outer trees, which were younger and lower and easier to reach, and let him have his time with the original tree at his own pace. 20 minutes later, he appeared beside her with a basket and started picking without any ceremony, and that was that. They worked in silence for a while. The orchard in October had a quality of light that was different from every other month, filtered through turning leaves, amber-edged, kind of light that photographers and painters spend whole careers trying to capture, and that working people mostly experience over their shoulder while they're doing something else. Wade told me something last week, Thorne said. He was reaching for a high branch, his voice easy and directed at the tree rather than at her. What did Wade tell you? He said that when you first arrived the second day, maybe the third, he heard one of the younger hands say something about you. About how you looked. He got the cluster of cherries and put them in the basket. He said he told the hands at supper to keep their opinions to themselves. He did, Rosa confirmed. I heard him. He also said. Thorne paused. He said he watched you hear it, the thing that was said. And he watched you not react. And he thought to himself, that's either a woman who hasn't heard it before and didn't understand it, or a woman who has heard it so many times she's learned to carry it without showing she's carrying it. Rosa kept picking, and then he decided, Thorne continued, that it was the second thing, and that any woman who had learned to carry that much weight without showing it was probably going to be worth the trouble. Wade is perceptive, Rosa said. He's been watching people for 60 years, Thorne said. He's had practice. Rosa set her full basket down and reached for the empty one. I did hear it, she said. And you're right that it wasn't the first time. Or the 101st. She looked at the cherry in her hand before putting it in the basket. It used to knock something loose in me every time. Even when I didn't show it. Something would come loose inside, and I'd have to put it back before I could keep working. She paused. I don't know exactly when that stopped, but at some point it stopped. When? Thorne asked. Rosa thought about it honestly. Somewhere between the first supper I cooked here and the morning I told you the flour was bad, she said. In there, somewhere. Because I was busy, and the work mattered, and the work needed me to be present for it, instead of managing what someone else thought of me. She looked at the tree. I think maybe that's the only cure there is. Not caring less about the opinion, but caring more about the work. Until the work is louder. Thorne picked for a while in silence. Then he said, I advertised for a cook, I know. I got a woman who told me my flour was bad, and reorganized my pantry and went to the county fair, after someone tried to collapse her kitchen, and started a program that now covers half the county. He paused. I want you to know I'm aware of the disparity between what I asked for and what I received. Rosa looked at him. Are you complaining? No, he said. I'm saying thank you. Rosa turned back to the tree. You gave me a kitchen to work in, she said. And you let me work. That's not nothing, Thorne. There are men who would have handed me an apron and a list of instructions, and never once asked what I thought the supply arithmetic said. She picked a cluster of cherries. You listened, from the beginning, before you had any reason to. It's not nothing. I argued with you plenty, he said. You argued and then you listened, Rosa said. That's the correct order. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. They worked through the morning and into the early afternoon, filling baskets, occasionally arguing about whether a particular cherry was ready or needed another week, discovering that they disagreed on this in a small, manageable way that was nothing like their early disagreements, and everything like the kind of disagreement people who trust each other have useful friction, not damage. By mid-afternoon, the baskets were full, and Rosa's hands were stained, dark red, and Thorne had a cherry stem inexplicably caught in his shirt collar that he didn't notice until she reached up and removed it, which made him look momentarily startled in a way that she found completely disproportionate to the action, and therefore privately delightful. Preserving starts tomorrow, she told him. I'll stay out of the kitchen, he said. You don't have to stay out of the kitchen, Rosa said. You just have to not be underfoot. Those are the same thing. They are not the same thing, Rosa said. Underfoot means in the way. Not underfoot means present, but not in the way. She picked up 2 baskets. You've been managing that distinction for months. You know how to do it. He picked up the other 2 baskets, and they walked back through the orchard gate together, which Rosa pulled closed behind them, not locked. Just closed, the way gates should be, and across the yard toward the kitchen. Nell Garrity's daughter was born in November. Rosa heard about it from Helen Kellerman, who came by the day after with the news and the particular glow of someone carrying good information. The baby was healthy. The labor had been managed well. Thomas Garrity had reportedly cried, which Helen reported with the satisfied specificity of a woman who considers a man, moved to tears by his child's birth, to be evidence of something important about his character. Rosa sent a preserving jar with Helen on her return trip, the sour cherry preserves, the good ones, from Lydia's tree, and a note that said, "For when you're ready for something that isn't broth. Congratulations to all 3 of you." Nell wrote back in December. A short letter, written in the same neat, careful script she used for her workshop notes, saying the preserves were exactly right at exactly the right moment, and the baby was being called Margaret. And Thomas had already started asking Nell to teach him the supply arithmetic, and that Nell had told him he should come to the Blackwood kitchen program in the spring, and he had said he would, which was something Nell had not expected and was glad to report. Rosa put the letter in her notebook. She had developed a habit, over the course of the year, of putting things in the notebook that weren't provision calculations or recipe adjustments letters, occasionally, or notes she jotted from conversations, or the thing Clara had said in August about the evening she and her husband had gone through the workshop notes together. She hadn't planned to start keeping this kind of record. It had just accumulated, the way things accumulate when they matter, and you don't want them to disappear. She was looking at the notebook one evening in December when Thorne came into the kitchen and sat down and looked at her, looking at it. "What's in there?" he said. "Everything," Rosa said, which was not an exaggeration. He looked at the notebook's worn cover. "Can I?" She slid it across the table. He opened it carefully, not the way you open something unfamiliar, but the way you open something you've been handed in trust, which is a different kind of careful. He turned pages slowly. The provision calculations from October of last year. Fair preparation notes. The workshop curriculum she'd developed over the spring. Clara's letter. Nell's letter. A note from Agnes Patterson in September that consisted of a single line. "You should know the Harlow family has enough grain to last the winter for the first time in 4 years." Thorne turned pages. He stopped at a page near the middle. Rosa knew which one without looking. She'd written it in February, the night of the conversation about Lydia, after Thorne had gone back to his room. It was not a long entry. It said, "He's been burying himself." When someone loves something and loses it, sometimes the only way they know how to honor it is to stop everything from moving forward. That's not honoring. That's just a different kind of loss. He read it. He read it twice. Then he turned more pages without saying anything about it, which was exactly what Rosa had hoped he would do. He closed the notebook when he reached the current date and slid it back to her. "You should keep this," he said. "I am keeping it," Rosa said. He paused, for longer than just the ranch. "This is a record of something." He looked at the notebook. The women who came. What they learned. What changed. He paused again. 43 women in a year. That's going to be more next year. Someone should be writing it down. Rosa looked at the notebook. She thought about 43 women and what they had carried into the Blackwood kitchen and what they had carried out. She thought about Dorothea learning in her 60s that her bread had been wrong for 30 years and not being ashamed of it and teaching other women the same thing from the inside. She thought about Agnes Patterson's family having enough grain for the first time in 4 years. She thought about Clara's letter and Nell's daughter being born healthy and Thomas Garrity learning the supply arithmetic. She thought about all the things that had come from one advertisement in an Ohio newspaper that had said no illusions offered and meant it. "Someone already is writing it down," she said. Thorne looked at her with the expression she knew completely now, not the closed, managed face of a man who has learned to keep the distance, but the open, direct look of a man who has decided to be exactly where he is and stop apologizing for it. "Good," he said. By the 2nd December, the kitchen had become something the county talked about differently, from how it talked about anything else in Coldwater. Not the fair, not the Harrow situation, which had faded into the kind of story people reference obliquely rather than directly, the way communities handle things that revealed something uncomfortable about themselves. Not even Rosa's win, which had been significant at the time, but was now the kind of story people had metabolized into something simpler than it had been. She came and she won, and she was right to, which was true as far as. It went but left out most of the actual substance. What the county talked about was the kitchen itself. Women who had been coming for 8 months brought their daughters in January. Daughters who had grown up watching their mothers struggle with provision shortfalls and failed bread and winter rationing. That wasn't working brought their own problems, and Rosa addressed them the same way she had addressed the first 12. Practically, without condescension, with the full assumption that the person in front of understanding anything explained if she explained correctly. Some of the men came. Not many, and not easily. There was a particular resistance in the men of Coldwater County to anything that looked like admission of not knowing, which Rosa recognized as the same resistance she'd seen in Thomas Garrity for months before he finally sent word to Thorne about the grain. The same resistance that had kept Emmett from apologizing to her for nearly a year before he finally did it over a birthday cake. The resistance didn't mean they didn't need the information. It meant they needed the entry point to be shaped correctly. Wade was the one who figured out the entry point. He started, in February of the second year, inviting the hands to come into the kitchen on Saturday mornings when Rosa was doing the week's bread and just be there. Not formally, not as students, just present. And Rosa would talk through what she was doing, and occasionally ask a question, and occasionally the men would answer, and occasionally they would ask something back. And after 3 Saturdays of this, Emmett had learned to test bread rise correctly, and 2 of the other hands had learned how to properly salt cure a side of beef, and none of them had been required to admit that they'd needed to learn any of it. Rosa did not say anything about this arrangement to Wade. She didn't need to. Wade knew she understood it, and she knew he knew, and they had reached the kind of working relationship where most of the important things were communicated without the burden of being said. Thorne watched all of it. He watched his kitchen become the county's kitchen in the gradual organic way that things become communal when they're genuinely useful, not through announcement or institution, but through the slow accumulation of people finding their way to a place that gives them something real and telling someone else about it. He watched Rosa move through it with the particular combination of authority and accessibility that he had seen in her from the first week. The quality that meant people told her things they hadn't planned to tell her, and then were glad they had. He loved her without reservation. This was not a small thing for Thorne Blackwood. He was constitutionally built for reservation, for the careful management of feeling, for the maintaining of appropriate distance, for the specific self-protection of a man who has lost something enormous and has built his entire subsequent life on the principle that you can honor what you've lost by keeping everything still. Rosa had made stillness impossible, not by force, but by example. By the sheer productive, unstoppable motion of a woman who had decided that staying meant working, and working meant moving forward, and that honoring the past was something you did with your hands still in. Motion, not with your hands folded and the gate locked. He told her this, one evening in the 2nd January, in the kitchen after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse. He told it to her badly imprecisely, without the clarity he would have wanted, losing the thread twice and having to come back to it, and she listened without interrupting. And when he'd finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I think changes a person? Not the big things. Not the disasters, not the losses, not the times everything goes wrong at once." She looked at her hands on the table, flour dusted still, the hands of a woman who has been working. The big things break you open, but what changes you is what fills the space after. The small things, the daily things, the bread you make every morning, people you let into the kitchen. She paused. You let me into your kitchen. You let me change the shelving. You listened to the supply arithmetic. You fixed the window correctly when it was slightly off-center, even though it cost a day's work. She looked at him. All of that. That's what changed you. Not one thing. All of it. Thorne looked at her. You changed me, he said. We changed each other, Rosa said. That's how it's supposed to work. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They stayed like that while the January wind moved around the outside of the house, and the stove settled into its nighttime sounds, and the kitchen the rebuilt, redesigned. Twice-saved kitchen with the east window, and the proper shelving, and the preserving room off the back door held its warmth against the cold, outside the way a good-built structure holds warmth, which is not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough to matter. In the spring of the second year, Wade made his joke. He made it at the kitchen table during a Saturday morning when Emmett and 3 other hands were present, and Rosa was at the work table, and Thorne was drinking his coffee in the chair he'd claimed as his, and it arrived the way Wade's observations arrived without preamble, into a gap in the conversation, as if he'd been holding it for a while, and had decided now was the correct time. Thorne Blackwood advertised for someone to cook supper. Wade said, in the tone of a man making a historical observation, and accidentally found the only woman stubborn enough to fix his entire life. The hands laughed. Emmett laughed loudest, which surprised nobody. Thorne looked at Wade with the expression he used for Wade's observations, somewhere between acknowledgement and resignation. Rosa kept working her dough. I didn't fix his life, she said without looking up. I fixed his kitchen. Same thing, Wade said. They are not the same thing, Rosa said. Close enough, Wade said and drank his coffee. Thorne didn't argue, which was Wade's version of being proven right, and everyone at the table understood this. And the kitchen was full of the particular warmth of a room where everyone present knows what they have in each other, and nobody feels the need to say it out loud. The cherry tree bloomed in April of the second year. Rosa saw it from the east window on a morning when she was up early, which was most mornings, because she was constitutionally an early riser, and had accepted this about herself the way you accept weather, and the bloom was fuller than it had been the previous year. The tree having had a year of being tended instead of neglected, and responding the way living things respond to being tended, which is imperfectly and specifically, and with a kind of gratitude that isn't sentiment but biology. She stood at the window with her coffee, and looked at the blooming tree in the April light, and thought about all of it. She thought about the woman who had planted that tree from a Wyoming seedling and carried it 3 days by stage, and put it in the cold ground and waited for it to become something. She thought about what it means to build something you might not live, to see completed not as tragedy, but as an act of faith in continuation. Lydia had planted a tree, Rosa had unlocked its gate. Someone after Rosa would pick its fruit and make something from it, and that person would not know Lydia's name or Rosa's, and that was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. The value of the work is not in being remembered for it. The value is in the thing itself continuing. She had arrived at Blackwood Ranch with 1 trunk and $41, and a body that strangers felt entitled to catalog, and a skill set that the right people had not yet seen. She had not arrived knowing she would rebuild the kitchen twice, or win a county fair, or start a program that fed information to 43 women in the first year and more in the second. She had arrived knowing she could work, and that the work was good, and that eventually, in some room somewhere, the work would speak for itself. That was the thing nobody tells you about being perpetually underestimated. It is exhausting and it is unfair, and there is no version of it that isn't a cost. But the specific cost of it, the years of carrying other people's dismissal without letting it knock you permanently sideways, that cost builds something in you. Not armor exactly. Capability. The ability to do your work in conditions that weren't designed for your success, and to do it well enough that eventually the conditions have to adjust. Rosa had never stopped being the size she was. She had never become more acceptable to people for whom her body was a judgment they'd already made. What changed was not her. What changed was the room around her, because the room eventually had to account for what she was doing in it. That was the lesson. Not that the world becomes fair if you're good enough. It doesn't. Not that other people's cruelty stops being real. It doesn't. But that you are not required to become smaller in response to it. You are not required to make yourself less so that their judgment feels more accurate. You can just keep working. And the work, if it's good work, if it's real, has a way of eventually becoming louder than everything said about you before you started. She heard Thorne's door. He appeared in the kitchen in his work clothes, with the particular look of a man who has not been fully awake for very long. which on Thorne Blackwood manifested as a slight softness around the eyes that he would not have allowed anyone to see a year ago, and that Rosa privately found more appealing than the fully armored version. He saw her at the window. He came to stand beside her without asking what she was looking at, because he could see the orchard from where she was standing, and he knew. "Full bloom," he said. "Full bloom," Rosa said. They stood at the east window together in the April morning and looked at Lydia's tree flowering in the pale early light. And Rosa felt Thorne's hand find hers, without looking for it, the automatic gesture of a man who has stopped calculating the distance between himself and what he loves. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him slightly, the small physical grammar of two people who have learned each other's weight. And they stood there while the morning came fully up over the orchard, and the cherry blossoms caught the light, and the kitchen around them smelled of the bread already proving under cloth on the work table. The bread that would feed 24 men in a few hours, and sometimes 30 women in a workshop, and occasionally a 19-year-old boy who ate 2 test batches without being asked and told you what was wrong with them, without knowing that he was teaching you something too. For a while, Thorne said, "What are you thinking about?" Rosa considered this. "Flower suppliers," she said, "and cherry trees, and the difference between preserving something and keeping it alive." Thorne looked at the orchard. "Those are different things," he said. "I know that now." "I know you know," Rosa said. She squeezed his hand once and went to check the bread. Behind her, she heard him pour his coffee, pull out the chair that was his chair, sit down at the kitchen table. The particular sounds of a man settling into a room he has decided to be in. Outside the east window, the cherry tree stood in full April bloom, impractical and temporary and alive, the way blooming things are alive, spending everything they have on a few weeks of color before the fruit comes, before the preserving, before the work begins again. Rosa pulled back the cloth on the proving bread, checked the rise with practiced hands, and started the next thing. The kitchen was warm. The window held the light, and the good, real, continuing work went on.